Good evening. I would like to call tonight's meeting of the City of Tacoma Park City Council to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Searcy,
Here.
Councilmember Fulcher,
Present.
Councilmember DeBala,
Present.
Councilmember Gibson,
Here.
Councilmember Siemens,
Present.
Councilmember Honzak, Councilmember Small,
Present and in house.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight, and happy Black History Month. I'm excited to talk through our proclamation this evening. There are no changes to tonight's agenda, but I do just want to walk through the upcoming agenda for the next few sessions. So on Wednesday, February the 8th, the council will have its regular council meeting. We will have a legislative update, voting session on first reading ordinance approving the FY23 budget amendment number 5, the first reading ordinance approving FY23 stormwater budget amendment number 2, and a presentation on stormwater management program overview, and a work session on procurement as it pertains to replacement roof for the recreation center. On February the 15th will be our regular Wednesday council meeting at 7:30. We will have a legislative update and a voting session. The voting session will include a second reading approving FY23 budget amendment number 5, single reading ordinance approving FY23 stormwater budget amendment number 2, and a single reading ordinance authorizing execution of a contract for the recreation center roof replacement. We will also have a work session on appointments to boards and committees. Just as a reminder, Monday, I missed one. Also in that work session on February the 15th, there's a tentative item regarding discussion of the city attorney's contract amendments in terms of his fees. On Monday, February the 20th, is President's Day. The city offices and facilities are closed on Sunday and Monday for the holiday. And I think that takes us to February the 22nd, which is our regular council meeting at 7:30. There will be a proclamation of Lee Jordan Day, and that's February the 23rd for the record. Legislative update, a public hearing on traffic calming for 2nd Avenue speed bump, a presentation from our Board of Elections for the 2022 election report and debrief, and a voting session regarding resolutions providing for appointments of boards and committees, and tentatively a single reading ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute an amendment to the city attorney's contract, and a work session pertaining to traffic calming, the 2nd Avenue speed bump, and a tentative item regarding the overview of process for traffic calming requests and sidewalk requests. And that takes us through March. And so as I mentioned for the record tonight, we have a proclamation in honor of Black History Month. Okay, so in honor of Black History Month, whereas during Black History Month, we reflect on the sacrifices and celebrate the many achievements and significant contributions made by African Americans to our economic, cultural, spiritual, and political development. And whereas Black History Month grew out of the establishment in 1926 of Negro History Week by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who is known as the father of Black History Month, and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH. And whereas the 2023 national theme for observance is Black Resistance, and pays homage to African Americans who have resisted historic and ongoing oppression in all forms, especially the racial terrorism of lynching, racial massacres, and police killings since arrival upon these shores. And whereas the theme is timely as we continue to reform the criminal justice system, which has disproportionately affected minority communities, and whereas the observance of Black History Month calls our attention to the continued need to battle racism and build a society that lives up to its democratic ideals, and whereas African Americans locally have and continue to make substantial contributions to industries of all kinds in our region and beyond, despite barriers placed before them because of the color of their skin, And whereas African American leaders and innovators have and continue to leave an indelible imprint on our community by presenting an example of the rewards of hard work and perseverance, we honor and celebrate those contributions, past and present, throughout the month of February. And whereas the City of Tacoma Park recognizes that racial and ethnic diversity enriches our community and acknowledges and challenges that African Americans face in achieving equity, opportunity, and social mobility. And whereas diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are priorities that we are committed to working with our community to eradicate racism in all forms, to provide an inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable future. And whereas the City of Tacoma Park is proud to honor the history and contributions of African Americans in our community throughout our region, state, and nation, we are determined to work towards eliminating disparities in communities of color and creating a better future, ensuring safety, trust, and belonging for all in our community. Now, therefore, I, Talisha Searcy, Mayor of the City of Tacoma Park, do hereby proclaim February 2023 as Black History Month in the City of Tacoma Park, and encourage all residents this month and throughout the year to observe, celebrate, and honor Black history and culture in our efforts to create a world that is more just, peaceful, and prosperous for all through appropriate programs, ceremonies, and activities. Proclaim this first day of February 2023. So thank you all so much. So again, happy Black History Month. And with that, do we have Ann today for the legislative update? Yes. Perfect. So we will turn things over to Ann Sikot, our legislative Annapolis guru, to provide us with a legislative update.
Thank you, Mayor Searcy. Buddy, wanted to just let you know things are kind of rolling in Annapolis. We've gotten a little bit of a slow start, which is typical during the first year of a four-year term. Most of the hearings have been briefings to get new members up to speed, and budget hearings are just starting. We're just starting with some of the bill hearings as well. We have some of the major bills that the city's interested in that have hearings, the Safe Roads Act, and we have coming up week after next, I believe, the ranked choice voting bill to help the city. So that stuff is moving along. I did want to circle back with everyone about a process issue, as we've been discussing that the last couple of weeks. And I do believe that the city clerk has shared with the council members and the mayor a review of the process related to the bills that we are reviewing and the opportunities for council members and or the mayor to weigh in. And we will share updated bill charts with the mayor and city council on a weekly basis. And if there are things that we've missed, let me know. If there's something you feel very significant about weighing in on, I think it's just confirming with the mayor, and then I'm happy to help make sure, especially for those of you that haven't done it before, that you're prepared, you know what to expect at a bill hearing. And then just clarifying as well, if there's something you want to testify on that personally matters to you, but isn't something that's a formal position of the city council, that you certainly can do that. It's nice just to touch base so that we know you're doing that, and then it's just making clear that you are speaking in the personal capacity, not as a council member. So that's all I have for this evening.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ann. I don't see any questions from the dais, and we really appreciate all of the hard work that you're putting in and keeping us informed. And again, if anyone has, if they see any bills based on the chart that we've been provided and you want to weigh in or you have any thoughts, please feel free to follow up with myself or the city manager, and we can make sure that we're coordinating with Ann accordingly.
And please know, it is going to get real busy real fast.
Oh, yeah.
Bills in the next 2 weeks. So I'll have a lot more to say in the coming weeks.
Great.
And I do have one.
Councilmember Small?
I'm sorry, and I do have one question about the bills that are on the, we were given. And it's about HB 182, the one about restrictive covenants. Are you, and you may or may not know at this point, but is there going to be any sort of action vis-a-vis the news stories about the difficulty in removing restrictive covenants? Is this a nexus for this, or is it just related to things that would prevent people from doing things with regard to the manner in which they would develop?
So you're answering a question on a bill this morning. I confess to everyone, I don't know how to read this. I am not an expert in restrictive covenants. As noted on the bill chart, city staff is going to be checking with the housing folks to see, how much this, does matter for the city. So the word is there. We will get back to you on that shortly.
Okay, I would just note that because, historically, not only was there recently a New York Times article or Washington Post article rather about restrictive covenants in the metropolitan area, but it is an actual thing in the New Hampshire Gardens area with regard
That's good to know.
the bills. So I was curious about it.
We'll find out. I will get back to you.
Councilmember DeBala?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the Safe Roads Act. Will you be drafting testimony? Will somebody else be drafting testimony? And how is that going to get circulated, if at all?
So because that's a reintroduction with a few changes of the
Okay,
bill that was introduced last year, we just updated the testimony, and we did submit that already.
so it's not substantively different
Correct.
than last year. I guess that was
Correct.
really my question. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Councilmember Small, do you have a?
I'm sorry.
Perfect. And also, Ann, thank you for bringing up ranked choice voting. I know that we sometimes are contacted by staff from Delegate Moon's office. So definitely would, and I don't believe do we have any testimony or anything prepared for that? I don't believe.
We do. There was testimony that the city clerk and someone from the city board of elections provided when the bill was heard, because it's a local bill from Montgomery County. It was heard by the Montgomery County delegation. The Montgomery County delegation subsequently voted in favor of the bill, and so now it's a House bill now in the General Assembly that has been scheduled for a hearing.
Okay. And so because of that, and I remember that the rationale for having the city clerk and board of members from the Board of Elections to write that testimony. So if there is a need for a member of the council to have testimony in support of that bill, just let me know.
Will do. Thank you.
All right. Okay, no more lights. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Have a Okay, now we're going to move on to public comments. We have public comments on, we do not have any voting items tonight. So if you have we'll start with people in the room. If you have any public comments on any matters. Okay. All right, we have no comments in the auditorium. City Clerk, do we have anyone sign up for virtual comments? Okay. Wonderful. Oh, well, this might actually go fast. So with that, we're going to move on to council comments. Councilmember Small.
Thank you, Mayor Searcy. I would also like to inform the clerk that I may go over the allotted 3 minutes here. I wanted to make sure that as we were beginning the illustrious month of Black History Month that we took some time to talk about a little bit about something that I think is profound and has been happening in this room that people may not have noticed, given what they may have perceived it to be. And I think the long and the short of it is that I told everybody on the day that I got elected that I used to tell people I was born on a mountaintop because of the incessant inculcation of indoctrination of values associated with the civil rights movement and civics and what that meant, and the expansion of the things like the franchise and things like that. And my own personal aptitude is really only a benefit of the legislative formulas that came out of the civil rights movement. And I think it's important to note that one, because if my father had an affirmative action opportunity to take an affirmative action test and get employed in the manner that he did, we wouldn't have ended up where we were. And randomly, when people were trying to actively integrate a small Midwestern town, my parents were lucky enough to be the people who were sold one of those houses. And so educationally, there had been a great deal of disquiet because the civil rights movement in large part didn't overtly happen in the Midwest. And so the acrimony in the school system had just subsided when my generation of kids entered. And so there was excitement and any number of things about the prospect of a whole new generation of kids having the opportunity to be educated equally. And then the opportunity to achieve excellence or gifted status in the context of that through opportunities and standardized testing was really important to me. And so here I am doing this because of what I was led to believe was important to both the communities that I lived in and the people that I am representing by my skin tone. And so the important thing about that is, as you go through a life in this area, if you come from someplace else and you're exceedingly idyllic, one of the things that you run into is the inevitability of the aristocracies associated with elitism and privilege, which is natural if you got a lot of different kinds of people going on. And those people want to make sure that their kids have opportunities too. So you're competing at a pretty high level to begin with. And I think that it's important for people to recognize as we sit up here, and as I sometimes am a provocateur in the way that I am on social media about the stagnation of our cultural social settings, that the important thing that they were trying to instill in us was the profound weight of competency, in that there was going to be a time where the actual ability to manipulate the levers and mechanisms of government or anything else was going to be the thing that was the payoff for a whole bunch of people, including my mama. And so when I got elected, I was pretty happy. I was happy to give my first testimony. I'm happy to be here today in the same way that I was both happy to be the first person to say on the record that we have our first black mayor, but also disappointed that it hadn't ever come up before. And so as we go into this Black History Month, I just wanted for everyone to note that if they perceive acrimony on the dais, and they perceive competency on the dais, and they perceive any number of things, the fact that it is an integrated group of people doing it, primarily vocally led by some relatively young black people, is in and of itself awesome, because it's just people doing the mundane things of trying to better their community and their society in boring ways, like in places where people don't come to watch because it's boring but important.
Thank you, Councilmember Smalls. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor, and I would like to also call attention to the city clerk that I may not stick strictly to the time tonight if my colleagues will allow me to go on a little bit longer. Not sure, I haven't tried to time what I'm going to talk about, but in light of the inhumanity of the slaying of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, I think it's important for us to talk about that in Tacoma Park and what it means here in Tacoma Park. You know, it's certainly easy for people to get on TV or sit at a dais and condemn the officers who slaughtered that poor man. But to actually solve the problems, what I've learned through my 23 years on the city council is that you have to look beyond just the officers because the problem is much deeper. And when I was first elected in 1999, one of the first issues that was brought to me was the excessive use of force by Tacoma Park police officers and against minority youth. And it took a long time to really, for me to understand what was involved and where the real problems lay. Like I say, you've got the officers who actually are using excessive force, but there are other officers that see that happening. And, you know, do they report that to their command staff to say that, hey, somebody's out of line here with what they're doing. They're not following what the laws of the land are. And how does the command staff react to it if they do go to them? Do they tell the officers who are reporting it to shut up? Or do they actually investigate it and hold the officers who are doing things wrong, hold them accountable for it? And what I learned through my years on the council is that quite often the command staff is supportive of the actions that are being taken on the street. And yet, you know, the command staff has a police chief. And the chief, you know, should be knowing what's going on within his department and the staff that he has. And so is the chief making sure that the command staff is actually doing their job and holding people accountable for the misdeeds that they do, and are they, you know, issuing out the appropriate punishments, whether it be, you know, writing them and putting a bad mark in their record, or docking them time, or actually firing them, or having them indicted if it was a criminal act. So, again, it's easy to blame the officers on the street, and there is certainly some blame there, but the problems, there's a lot of blame that should be going around beyond just the officers themselves. And it doesn't stop with the police chief, because like in this city, there is a city manager and a city council that oversees the police department. And, you know, there was a council that heard about these problems and turned to the city manager and the police chief and said, well, is there anything going on wrong? And if the police chief says no, or the city manager says no, then the council, you know, goes back to doing their boring business. The buck doesn't stop here, though, the council, because the real power is the people, right? We hear that all the time, the power in the people. There was time in Tacoma Park while I was on the council where officers were arrested for excessive use of force and convicted, and yet there was not a whole lot of outcry from the community. There was an incident where a canine dog was let loose in a house and attacked a woman who was asleep in her own bed, and there was a little pushback from the community. And people read the news article and said, oh, this is horrible, and then went on about their daily work and didn't press the council for anything about that. So there's a lot of people involved in these decisions. It isn't just, poor judgment on some officers. They certainly did a horrendous thing, an inhumane thing, and need to be held accountable. But there's accountability that needs to be held beyond that. So what changed here in Takoma Park and how we've addressed that problem through these 23 years is the council has changed through the years, and we ended up with a city council who cared about this issue. And when we went out to search for a new police chief, we wrote the standards that we wanted to see in a police chief. And among those, most key among those, is that we wanted a police chief who wanted to have a department that was guardians of the community, guardians of public safety in Takoma Park, rather than being warriors to go out there and fight crime. And that's when we hired Chief Duvall, who's now the police chief here. But that certainly didn't change things. What changed things is the work that Chief Duvall has done since he's been here to find the right personnel in the police department who have the desire to be guardians, not to be fighters. And he's also implemented training and other things within the department to change the culture of the department from warriors to being guardians. He's done an excellent job so far. He's moved us a long way in the right direction. I'd like to say that we could never have any excessive use of force again in the city. I'm not being that unrealistic. Police work is a hard, dangerous business, and people's temperaments and emotions can get overloaded. But Chief Duvall has works on recognizing that. He has staff working on the command staff, working on keeping people accountable, and recognizing when people are being too stressed and need to have some relief. So again, I just want to reassure the community that Takoma Park is aware of these difficulties in police departments, that we have worked long and hard on that through the years, and I think we've moved a whole lot in the right direction to minimize the chances of something like happened in Memphis, to minimize the chances of that happening here in Takoma Park. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Councilmember Siemens. Councilmember Gibson.
I won't speak as long as my colleagues, but I want to say that I am proud to be on this council with this mayor and with my colleagues, both on the council and in the staff. I'm proud to serve and work in partnership with you all, and with the larger issue and proclamation. I simply bow my head to all the great Black Americans that suffered and fought for justice and peace.
Thank you, Councilmember Gibson. All right, well, would everyone just kind of join me in a quick moment of silence, recognizing the death of Tyree Nichols and so many other Black and brown people in this nation at the hands of what I can only say is racist bias. And so together, collectively, my hope is that each one of us in our daily lives acknowledge that these biases may exist, although they may be subconscious, acknowledge them and take an active step to undo those thoughts in your head that may cause you to view another person for some outward reason as not being equal to you, a human. So if everyone would just join me for a quick second in a moment of silence for Tyree Nichols. Thank you so much. So I'm excited. This is Black History Month. I'm the first elected Black mayor, so this is awesome. It's like and my birthday's in 2 weeks, so I'm just living the dream. But I do have a few boring reminders. First, I want to thank all of the nonprofit groups that came out to Piney Branch Elementary School on Saturday of last week for Kindness Day. It was such a wonderful opportunity to work with Small Things Matter, Impact Silver Spring. There were so many wonderful organizations there, and they provided much needed food boxes, collected donations of used clothing, taught kids how to plant trees and little things. So it was such a wonderful experience. So I want to thank all of the organizations that participated last week. On Saturday, I will be at the Tacoma Park Middle School used book sale. So I will have an opportunity to read to the group on Saturday. I want to encourage people to come out to that. Also tomorrow is the University Boulevard Purple Line Community Advisory Team meeting, or the CAT meeting for the Purple Line. That's tomorrow at 6 o'clock. I know Councilmember Small will be participating. One thing that I do want to remind folks, because I did see some questions around ability to speak. CAT meetings usually have CAT members have the opportunity to speak and ask questions during the meetings. They often will allow some time for public comments, but not a lot, and they don't accept comments ahead of time. So just to make sure that folks are aware of that process, that's the process that they used previously. We're dealing with a new contractor. It's possible that that process may change, but in the past, comments were limited to community advisory team meeting members.
Mayor, I'd just like to add to that, that I did speak with the, at least the state transportation people side of this, and they did intend that there would be a time for public comments and some separated time to discuss them, but they weren't more indicative of it than that.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so that means the process is for the most part the same. So the community advisory team meeting members can interact, and then they have a period for public comments, and then beyond that. So just so that folks know, typically after those meetings, comments, presentations, and recordings are made available online. And with that, without seeing any other comments, I would like to turn things over to our city manager.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And this evening, nothing.
Okay, perfect. So adoption of minutes, not today. Okay, no worries. So just a question for the city clerk. For the next council meeting, we will have which comment minutes will we need to vote on? The 9th and the 11th. Okay. So we'll make sure we add that to the agenda. Okay, perfect. All right. So now we can turn things over to our city manager as we talk about the FY 2023 budget amendment number 5.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of council. This evening before you is budget amendment number 5. In this budget is majority of a reduction budget. Before I have the Director Chung come forward and provide some comments, and we open up the council for any questions, what you have in your materials, I just want to cover a couple items. What we've added just recently this week, the last couple of days, is the interest rate for the bank deposits. There was a change last year when Director Chung came before council. The bank deposits were at 0.02%, and it was assumed at that time that it will stay at that rate for the entire fiscal year. After a number of the federal interest rate increases, the bank deposit interest rate increased to 2%. So Director Chung expects an increase in revenue by the end of this fiscal year, which is great news for us. The second item that you'll see in the general government until you get to housing is vacancy savings, and those savings are from July 1st, beginning of this fiscal year, through January 31st, through yesterday. It's about $742,000 in savings. So when you look at on the document, you'll see general government, all those on the first page, and you take general government all before you get to housing and community development. All those, you'll see the different vacancy savings, and in the comments that you were provided earlier today, which positions those vacancy savings come from. The key with the savings, with these savings is $742,000, and that's just for the first half of the year. And those savings this year, it would not be the same next year because we're hiring a lot of the positions as directed by council. So for this year, well, for next year, you won't see the same vacancies because they're going to be filled next year. But we're working through trying to hire the positions this fiscal year. We'll have those positions hired very soon. With the savings, the budget reduction would affect the budget by essentially limiting the amount that staff has to actually spend. So with the vacancy savings this year, what you're going to be doing is taking the expenditures, which you approved in the last budget at $36.5 million, and decreasing it by the $1.5 million that's on this document here, which will bring what we can actually spend in the budget right now to $35 million. By the time we get to the end of the fiscal year, anything that we have not spent will go into the unassigned. And that's what we do year-end cleanup in the year. So I just want to be clear on that. So if there's questions talking about where the savings going, is it unassigned? Unassigned is at the end of the year. What we're talking about now is just reducing the amount that we can actually spend. So it's limiting that expenditure number in the budget. And the rest of the items that you see here, the Special Revenue Fund represents the increase in expenditures for grants that we've received, which you'll see a lot in there's three departments. You got Housing Community Development, there's Public Works, as well as Public Works and HCD are the two essential departments that have essential functions that we receive grants for. And then you have the ARPA piece is the last section there. And those are items and initiatives that we won't be able to do this year that we'll be looking to move into '24 to try to move forward and get done with the idea of getting everything encumbered by the end of December 31st of '24, try to have all the projects done. But as you know, with ARPA, council may reappropriate those items at any given time throughout the fiscal year. With that, I'll ask Director Chung, is anything else that I need to cover with this?
Well, Director Chung is coming up. Can I ask for
Councilmember
clarification?
Councilmember DeBall.
At the very beginning, you said there were
Thank
two
you,
changes.
City Manager. I think the City Manager cover almost everything that we have to discuss tonight about this general fund budget amendment, as well as the other funds, including the ARPA fund and also the Special Revenue Fund. And there is a small reduction of salary savings in the stormwater as well. So that's in the budget amendment 2 of the stormwater fund. And it's mainly because of the vacancy savings.
Councilmember DeBala, what you were saying, when I first started, what was added was, you see the interest and dividends at the top, and it's, yeah,
The second one I missed.
the interest bond trust fund?
Okay.
Yep, those two together is, yeah,
Yeah, and the interest bond, we have a restricted bond, and it's that the fund is available right now is about $6 million, and it's currently in a trust fund. Since these are the unused bond funds that in the trust, and we are accumulating interest every day, and the interest is based on the market. So if the market interest rate goes higher, the interest revenue we receive from this trust fund is going to be higher. So it just follow the market interest rate. So it's similar to the bank deposit from the Truist Bank. I have been talking to the account manager several times and urging him to follow the market, because the Federal Reserve chairman has been increasing the interest rate nearly every month, 75 basis point. So they should do the same thing to our bank deposit. So finally, last month, actually December of 2022, our interest income for our checking account become $22,000, and it was used to be just $200.
Thank you so much. I do have a quick question, because I want to make sure, you know, the terminology of things is clear. And I get that we are, because of the, I guess, the hiring freeze or the number of positions that have been vacant for one reason or another, there's potential budgetary cost savings. But I guess this question is for the city manager. Those positions were included in the budget to begin with, right? So if we didn't need the positions, then why were they in the budget? You see what I mean? So like we budgeted and approved a budget for a certain number of FTE based on an understanding that those FTE were mission critical and necessary. But it looks like, based on this, a lot of them may not have been. So, because they went from basically a half a year, and if that's just not natural attrition of people just naturally moving in and out, if there was a purposeful hold, then were those positions necessary?
Madam Mayor, yes, the positions were necessary, but we've also had some transition in the city. A lot of departments, a lot of positions went vacant, and it took a lot of time to try to recruit. Sometimes we went out several times to recruit a lot of these positions, and so it got to the point, like I said, early January is when I talked to the departments about looking at putting in a freeze to see if we can hold some positions. But all the positions here are mission critical to the departments, and if the department heads were here, they would say it's critical, but it's a lot of different things, from the hiring and trying to hire the right people. And like I said, when last year from July, August, September, when we had a lot of people transition out of the city and trying to fill those positions, and when I sent council the transition plan of how we have the 2 acting deputies and everyone else. So there was some shifting that had to go on to be able to make sure operations were still moving forward.
Okay. And so one thing that is also important to note is it wasn't necessarily the case because of council's vote to actively hire, as you said, these mission critical positions, that we're not going to see the savings in the future. Like, my understanding is that we voted, and I know what I voted for. I voted in favor of filling these positions in accordance to what was in our budget and what has been communicated as being mission critical in order to do the work. And so if these positions happen to all be filled magically, because I'm taking I get it. It's really hard to hire staff right now. So I'm assuming that you're still going to end up with vacancies come the end of the fiscal year, right? And so, but I guess what I'm trying to understand is how that will ultimately be reflected in your next budget, right? So if we're thinking about the next budget, are we, and this is for you all to think about, are we expecting to see increases in FTEs when we had such difficulty with filling all of these positions as well, right? So that's just, I mean, don't have to answer, but that is something to be mindful of. And so this is the staff, basically the cost savings associated with unfilled positions, attrition, whatever, for whatever reason, through January. And so the expectation is for the last quarter, or I guess the last quarter of the fiscal year, we would likely see if whatever remaining cost savings from any other positions that perhaps have not been filled, that balance of salaries, right? We would see that also in another budget amendment towards the latter part of the fiscal year, correct? Okay. One thing that we did, and thank you so much, Director Chung, for like explaining this. Oh, no, I'm not letting you out the hot seat. But you explained this really well about how the carryovers, how that ultimately goes into our, depending on what those items are, will go into our committed but unassigned reserve. One of the things that I would like to ask in the next budget is to be able to specifically see what those items are that are in the committed, unassigned reserve, that are in essence projects that for one reason or another were not done in the prior fiscal year. That would be helpful, I think, in terms of, from a council's perspective, if that item that was in the committed but unreserved, unassigned reserve fund, and we see as a council, you know what, this isn't a priority anymore. We weren't able to get it done in 2023. Maybe we need to just let that money stay and move it into the unassigned reserve, like uncommitted, right? Because I think as of right now, I know for me personally, once we do this kind of carryover, there's this automatic assumption that those activities are automatically embedded in the next budget, which eliminates our ability to say, or to ask some hard questions about whether or not this is work that actually can and should and will get done in the next fiscal year. So if we can at least be able to see that, maybe if it's not in the budget document itself, if it is some sort of, as we're walking through the budget, having a way to kind of see what some of those projects are, that would be really helpful for me. And it'll also be helpful as we're trying to make decisions around reserve funds amounts, because it is very confusing to see that in fact we have about $7 million in reserve, but just a large chunk of that is committed due to projects that we said we were going to do, and I'm not quite sure where we are with those. So that would be something that would be helpful for me. Councilmember Small.
Thank you, Mayor. There are a lot of, I guess I would associate myself with your comments first, but I think I would also just like to reiterate there's some things about the nomenclature here that I personally am uncomfortable with in a budgetary philosophy from my own previous experiences. And so I just wanted to make sure that we were talking about those things, because I personally, it's my understanding that there are no cost capture savings in a budget that has been ratified by the council, in that it is supposed to be a plan and a methodology associated with what's supposed to happen for the year. And so philosophically, unless there is a catastrophic change in the policy associated with that council, then they're not savings as much as they are unspent dollars. And so that's the first thing that I wanted to say is that and insofar as they're unspent dollars, to move them back into the reserve at this point, to me, is an interesting move, because there's also presumably going to be a reallocation at the end of the year if there are places within the budget as it stands where you have overspent. And so the flexibility of putting it into the reserve and then requiring it to come out of the reserve seems like just a thing that you could theoretically do differently if you wanted to. And so but that's just a quibble. I think the other part of this is that I just think it's important for people to understand that, when you say mission critical or something like that, we all understand that in different ways, whether we're government employees or understand jargon from TV or whatever else. But the reality is that each one of these positions that's not filled presumably has some sort of policy involved with it. And so the juxtaposition of not having staff and not having the implementation of policy or services is the same. And so I just am uncomfortable not having a more sober and reflective set of jargon language about this, particularly since we're talking about money that lapses at the end of the year if it's not spent anyway, insofar as it goes directly into your funds by law. And so that's another philosophical thing. If you've signed some contracts that you expect to fulfill in the next year, then you outline those in the next year's budget and whatever else. And it just seems to me that particularly if we're about to go into a budget cycle and we're going to be talking about where we are when the constant yield rate comes out and the individual tax rate for everyone on their individual properties comes out, because that's really where the rubber hits the road here. And if we're talking about whether or not we're going to hold to the constant yield rate or hold the current rate that we have, insofar as it may be a reduction, it depends on where the inflation is, those calculations are directly based on, presumably, the effective administration of those services. And so when and particularly from my perspective as a council person, when you hear lots of things from people, residents in Ward 6, about whether or not we are being gouged in our property values and what are we seeing for the value that we get and those kinds of things. And then we have a budget where we have both significant attrition or hiring freeze or some combination thereof, and policy stress associated with it. And then we start talking about new numbers. If people start coming up to me and talking about how, well, obviously we have a bad government, we don't do things, and talking about moving numbers around, it could be a red herring with regard to the vision that people have about what Tacoma Park ought to be doing, either by the people that elected or the people that work here, or the euphemisms associated with being the Berkeley of the East or the People's Republic or someplace weird or whatever else. And so I do think it's important to say that given this, I would argue, and I'm going to officially say when we get to the budget cycle, that we should hold to the constant yield rate as it comes out, because theoretically, it would be a budget that is full of enough money to do wonderful things. Since there are so many things that are relatively positive about what are going on here, and there are so many positions unfilled. I think the implications of this and the natural stresses that people have, or natural opinions that people would have about who's getting hired and when and where that is, it's difficult and unfair. to assume that there are pressures being put on people that are not policy. And it's, the last thing I will say about this, and I'll hold my powder for a while, is that last week the Public Works Director used a wonderful word, and that word is morass. And it's a word that indicates things like quagmires and complexities and not being able to see or understand what the actual thing is. And I have also been allegedly discourteous to our effective treasurer. And I don't think people understand that I haven't necessarily been that. But what I have been is severely concerned about the implications of the manner in which we talk about these things. Because ultimately what we are saying is that we have provided less services than we had envisioned as a community based on the lack of funding for those things, because there weren't people to do those things. And so it all snowballs downhill. And I don't necessarily think it's of value to consider any of that savings. Thank you.
Councilmember DeBala?
My questions, I think, are similar, but more, I don't know, practical? I don't know, more like questions. So, the first thing is, to be clear, so we have the supplemental table that Lori sent us. Great, thank you very much. And a list of vacant positions. And not surprisingly, because of a bunch of changes with, people being promoted and temporarily and all that, all three of these things don't quite add up. What I would find useful is in the vacancies table, a little bit more information, which I thought I had asked for the first time around. The status of the vacancy. So is it being advertised, or is it already an interview? Is it, are we a month out from hiring somebody? Are we 4 months out from hiring somebody? That would be useful for me to know. Because it's kind of hard to match up. My second question is this budget amendment detail. Is this the salary savings from a position, or is it the net salary savings? So for example, salary savings from not having a deputy city manager, but there's costs associated with having two acting deputy managers, presumably. So is this net, or is this just the savings? And if this is just the savings, where's the costs for the people who are getting paid more because they're in acting positions? Is that coming later, or is it in here? Did I get the question clear?
I think it makes sense. You should use some black numbers.
You see what I'm saying? Should I try that again?
I think I understand what you're saying. We'll have to follow up and follow back up with you on that.
Okay, so if we're being asked to vote on a budget amendment, I want to know not only what's here, but what's not here, what's coming, or if it should be here. So that would be the net costs, or either the net costs or the actual. I mean, you guys figure it out. The vacancies, sort of where we are in that process. So what I think I voted for was to not have a hiring freeze, but to look at whether in fact some of these positions should be put on hold at some point. So my question to the city manager, my next one is, you had talked about two things. One, putting positions on hold. And we kind of cut you off in the middle of that, but I still want to hear the answer, which ones you think we need to put on hold. And I want to know, I believe you mentioned that you had a 3%, a 5%, and a 7% budget reduction requests to different department heads for this fiscal year. And so would you be coming back to us at some point recommending something on the program side?
There wouldn't be anything coming back to recommend on the program side. And as far as all the vacant positions, there are some positions on here, there's like 2 or 3 that folks are already through the process. Of the 26, I think it was about 12 of those positions that all the positions, each department is working with HR, and we put out. There's a lot of the positions that's already posted online.
Right.
And others are coming online
Right.
soon. So the anticipation for each of the department and expectation is over the next couple months, all the positions will be hired.
Okay, so I would appreciate the detail on that. Not right this second, obviously, but I would appreciate knowing for each position where we are in the process. And if there are any that you think really ought to wait, because there might be. And along with that, whether there are, I wasn't going to ask you, but does that mean you're not thinking about the 3% and the 5% and the 7% cuts for this year anymore?
Currently at this point, no.
Okay.
We have understanding on where the departments, most of the departments, their projects are moving forward, and whether they have contracts for those projects or they're all way down the path on meeting, expending their budgets for those projects. What we're doing right now is having conversations on our CIP with our budget committee, with our senior leadership team, and understanding what the fiscal year 23 projection is going to be, where we think we're going to end the year. So we're having those conversations now. We'll be waiting another 2 weeks when the constant yield comes out, and also start talking about fiscal year 24 budget development, what that will look like, looking at the quarter 2 that we presented and provided everyone, looking at that, looking at where our revenues are, and wait to hear if there's anything else that council would like to be considered in the next budget that's presented. But that's kind of where we are right now with the process.
Okay, all right, so the 3%, 5%, and 7% cuts, they were aimed mostly at the general fund. I guess I did.
So the
I knew
3,
that,
5,
but
and
I
6.
didn't say it.
So the 3, 5, and 7 was looking at the general fund,
General fund,
and
okay.
looking at that time, we were going to compare that. So this budget amendment 5 was going to be a little bit larger originally. So right now, what you have is just 6 months worth, so 742,000. What the vacancy savings would have been was about right around 1.4 million. And there were some other items in each of the departments that possibly could have been reduced to the actual expenditure line, which would have yielded about another $1 million. So there would have been 2.4 million altogether that would have been brought forward. And looking at hiring these positions, we're moving forward and having some more conversation on those other items, because those other items may be necessary now that we are actually hiring those other positions.
Right, okay. So that gets to my next question, what didn't get done? And was there a savings associated with that for the positions that have been vacant? So the positions have been vacant, the work isn't getting done. Is there some program savings from that is gonna at some point get captured? And I think I heard you just say no.
So even though that the positions have been vacant, the work has still been going on. We've been working with other staff members to be able to also take on some of those additional work in the department. And each department realigned their workflow and their processes to be able to make sure work continues to go, and there's no change in operations.
And I'm sure some projects are behind schedule, and when staff are hired, then we'll catch back up and all of that, okay. But that was one of my questions as well. Two more questions, and then I'm done. Thank you for all this time. You sent to us the second quarter financials. I know that's not exactly on the topic of this, but in my mind, they're related. Is there any, and I looked at the second quarter financials, thank you very much for them. To me, they make sense. I understood the tables, but is there anything that either of you feel we need to call out for us to make sure we understand right now? Is there anything unusual, out of line with the second quarter? I've been looking at them now for 5 years, so I didn't see anything, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to say, is there anything out of line?
The only,
Anything that we should know about? Let me put it that way.
The second quarter financial is pretty much similar to the first quarter financial, because a lot of expenditure, they are not actually spent. The contract and also the other costs, they are not actually spent at the right time. Meaning that a lot of the expenditures that we see from the general fund could be, some could be delayed because of the project delay. There could be some project delay. And also on the revenue side, we are usually 1 month or 2 months behind collecting from the Montgomery County, and a lot of property tax, they're not on time. Like, for example, right now, we are in the month of February, but we're still collecting something from the county and from the state for December of
And that's
2022.
not because we're doing
So
anything.
it seems like that both revenue and expenditure, they are not on a on-time basis. So everything is delayed and behind. So it looks like that we are on point, because it's showing the revenue is actually higher than the expenditure. But the bulk of the expenditure usually happen between
second half.
June and July, and sometime in
Okay.
August. So it's a very difficult part to estimate what is going to happen. But this is what we are working on right now on the CIP, what we project the fiscal year 23 CIP would be, because CIP meaning Capital Improvement Program, that is our most expensive projects, a lot of large projects, and, for example, the library and also all those are included in the capital improvement project. So we are trying to look at those items and find out from the directors and the managers, just try to give us a good estimate of what it would be, by June 30th, 2023.
Okay.
And
great.
also, if those projects are completed, then 2024, then we would not have, hopefully, we would not have a lot of cost that is moving and carry forward to the next year. We try to avoid that, yeah. So that's all I can say about the
Yeah, that's great.
the second quarterly.
Yeah.
It looks good because the revenue actually is
And because
it's
the
quite
expenditures are
significant
lagging.
with
for
the
reasons we just
with
discussed.
the in lieu of police, and also the in lieu of
Yeah, that
the
slew
role.
of police number's nice, isn't it?
Yeah, because
a
they,
big
they,
one.
they usually give it to us around the second quarter, but this year they actually gave it to us a lot earlier.
Really?
So it's making our financial looking better.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And so we've talked about the general fund and the special revenue fund and the stormwater fund are in this budget. And then the last piece is, capital improvement, which is not in this budget amendment, at least not that I noticed. And last but not least, ARPA. So that looking at the 4 budget items for ARPA that are proposed to be, yeah, so this also says budget reduction, and I guess that's my question. There's enough changes here and in a couple of the other programs that we are, that you all have been working on, that I wonder when we need to take a look. I think we need to take a look at ARPA, at the ARPA program overall, sooner rather than later, and see what make sure we're still, the priorities that the previous council said, we gotta do these programs first and these programs later, make sure that's still where this group wants to be, because this is now budget reductions for things, one of which at least I thought was pretty important. So I'm gonna ask when we will be doing a broader look at the ARPA budget and programs, excuse me. And I'm looking at Roz because I figure you're going to tell her, yeah, just turn it over to her. Yes.
So we don't have a date set. I recognize the need to come back to council. What we see tonight in this is things we recognize aren't going to happen between now and June 30th. So when council approved the ARPA funds, you laid out a 5-year spending plan
Right.
for them. And so we recognize, because ARPA is all an additional add-on to already a full
Yes.
workload, some of that just, we can see now that we're not going to get it done in the remaining 5
Yeah.
months.
So then my question is, this says budget reduction,
For FY '23,
and then where does the money go? What
So
does
the-
it say about where it goes?
the ARPA fund is discrete
Right.
in and of itself. So the ARPA funds don't go out of the ARPA pot. And Susan has more official language probably for this, but the ARPA funds that are not spent between now and June 30th still remain in the ARPA special fund.
Maybe that needs to be spelled out somewhere.
Those
So I'm
do,
looking at the ARPA, I'm looking at the actual language of the resolution, and it says reduce, 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 and it doesn't say, as it has, well, in ARPA, we haven't had this before, but in other years, we've had it, where it goes.
and I think that's because ARPA stays in ARPA, so
So
it
let's,
does
maybe we
not,
should spell it out. Maybe this is, okay, this is a suggestion, a suggested amendment to the ordinance.
unlike general fund expenditures that are unspent and revert to the unassigned reserve, ARPA funds do not. They stay in the ARPA fund.
Well, and so, I know I said I didn't have another question, but now I do have another question. So a lot of this says reduce, which is different language from budget amendments in the past. And I thought I just heard you say that in essence, we go from a $36.5 million budget to a $35 million budget. So it doesn't go back into some reserve. Or does it?
If I may,
Please.
ARPA fund and the other city fund, for example, speed camera fund, stormwater fund, and also the special revenue fund, they are not, the remaining fund, they are called fund balance. They are not called reserve. only in the general fund that we have separate type of restriction of reserve. We have a bond, restricted bond reserve, and we have other committed reserve like the equipment replacement reserve and also unassigned reserve. But in other fund, for example, the stormwater, the speed camera, and ARPA, they are called fund balance, and there's only one fund balance. Okay, so that's the difference. And I want to point out, especially for the ARPA fund. ARPA fund is a federal government grant. Okay, it's a federal government grant. So the federal government have some restrictions of how we should use the fund. And the way that we recognize the ARPA fund revenue is you need to spend the fund first before we can actually recognize the fund.
Right,
If,
you wrote that in something.
yeah, exactly. So if we haven't spent the money and the remaining fund is not going to the fund balance, it is actually going to an account, a holding account, which we call unearned revenue. The revenue has not been earned yet, so we put it there. But once we spend the money, the unearned revenue will move to the revenue part that will be compensating the expenditure that we have. So whatever we spend, it will be compensated by the unearned revenue. And then the remaining money is still staying in the unearned, because as we know that the ARPA fund for itself is, if we do not spend the money by that designated time, or it's not encumbered, we may have to return back to the Fed, to the Treasury Department. So this is a special rule that related to ARPA that we need to observe.
And have we got already the second tranche? And that came in, just so for everybody to know, that came in when, roughly? Last July? Okay. And then, is this how we did it last year? Is this the way that we accounted for salary positions that were not filled, and therefore there was vacancy savings? And you may not know the answer off the top of your head, but is this how we did it last year? Did we literally reduce the amount of spending allowed for the city?
Yes.
Okay. I think I'm finally done. Thank you.
But I do want to pick up on one thing that Councilmember DeBala brought up that I think is important from the perspective of clarity. So this is what is in the resolution for one of the ARPA expenditures. Reduce $125,000 from account blah, 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 social services grants to nonprofit, project delay due to insufficient staff capacity to complete the project in the current fiscal year, and funds will be repurposed in fiscal year 2024.
I can respond to that. We have recognized that the language we have typically used somewhat casually and perhaps inaccurately of carryover is not the appropriate term. So we've been trying to find ways to articulate that we would expect to come back to council to say, you had allocated these funds, this is the time period, it wasn't spent in this year, we expect to continue this work. So I think repurpose may be misunderstood. It could also mean council has the option of looking again at things and saying, we have identified other more urgent needs. And I expect to come back to council. I think that's part of what Councilmember DeBala was asking about, of coming back and looking at the whole picture. I will say we haven't, expect to have an ARPA manager coming on board in the next month. And I know it'll take that person a little time to get up to speed, but it'd be, we're looking forward to having that extra.
That's exciting.
Yeah, having that extra person to help package this and focus on this exclusively.
Yeah.
Can I follow up to something, to what you just asked?
Yeah, sure.
So, I guess I'm having trouble with the flow chart of statements about the ARPA money in particular. particularly with some of the decisions that we've actually undertaken as a council with regard to the ARPA money. And I think specifically that is that if we just voted to potentially take $2 million more away from a dedicated ARPA source that has to be spent in order to allocate the money associated with the federal spending program, because we wanted to have additional flexibility to do ARPA stuff, but we aren't doing ARPA stuff because we expect to do ARPA stuff. But one of the things that I asked about was, what are the proposed allocations of ARPA funds from the staff? How are we supposed to know whether or not any of these are good decisions or anticipate positive decisions in the future? Like, are we just going to decide that, oh, well, we're going to change the requirements on how we distribute the individual allocations of money to people so we can figure out more people to give money to? Or, like, are there policy things associated with this? Like, I just don't understand how this sort of devolves with regard to that.
Yeah, so one thing I will say, and I do want to acknowledge the other lights, but there was a lot that went into the decisions around the projects that ultimately the council approved for the ARPA funds. I think one of the things that Councilmember Small, I think you brought this up earlier, there's this self-feeding monster, right? So you don't have staff, work can't get done, you now are carrying it over, and then the question becomes, well, should we be doing this anyway? Well, we probably would have gotten it done if you had staff to do it, right? So there's a difference between we don't have staff capacity to finish projects because we have not had, I think HCD probably had how many people? Like they just got a housing manager and it was what, how many FTE were they short?
Yeah, there's a lot of FTEs.
Yeah, so they're short a bunch of FTEs, and yet they had the bulk of the ARPA stuff, and then we didn't have an ARPA manager, so this is what happens. So I think the biggest thing is making sure that, you know, if it is just a matter of staff capacity, and then once those FTE are in place, everybody still thinks this is a good idea, we move forward and prosper. But if it is, for one reason or another, staff says, hey, you know what, this was a good idea at the time, but the world has changed and we need to modify things a bit, it would be helpful to kind of have some window into that is an issue that we need from a council perspective. What the prior council thought was a good idea, now that we're out there in the streets, it's harder than we thought, we need to rethink. So I think if we are in that position, that would be very helpful to know to Councilmember Small's position. But if we're in the place where the prior guidance that the council provided was spot on, is still relevant, we just ran into some staffing shortages and we couldn't get the work done, then that to me is that's a different animal. That means once they get the FTE and they're able to move it forward, we just have to say this is something that's going to happen in 2024, and the ARPA money stays where we're in ARPA and it stays as a budgeted project. So I think when we are going through the discussions around ARPA, those are some of the things that we'll have to definitely be clear about, because I'm kind of hesitant to say that some of these things should not be done, because looks like the bulk of these justifications is we didn't have staff. And then you look at the FTE for like, in some cases, some of these could have been open for 5-6 months. So I think that is the piece that I think is really important for us to kind of see how things flesh out in terms of the staffing front. Want to go to the next slide. Councilmember Fulcher.
I don't really understand the racial equity considerations. It says many of the carryover items in the ARPA fund will assist people being disproportionately affected by COVID-19 via direct and indirect funding. But if we're taking money that was being spent on ARPA projects and it's going to later be spent on ARPA projects, how is that like helpful in the racial equity? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, yes, and where are you seeing?
Oh,
Here it is. Yes,
I mean,
yeah, makes sense to me.
if it's not doing anything as far as racial, like helping racial equity, like I would rather it say we were unable to determine something positive or negative from this, but maybe I'm not seeing it.
May I? Put another way, if we're cutting ARPA money, how can we be saying what we say in this racial equity statement? Is that what your question is?
I'm saying if we're holding on to ARPA money that we're later going to spend, but we were going to spend it anyways.
Yeah,
How did that
okay.
improve
Got it.
racial equity?
Do you want a response?
Sure.
I mean, I think, I assume you're looking at the cover memo, the council cover memo for this item. I think that's not specific to the change in the budget amendment as much as just calling out the fact that council specifically highlighted a number of ARPA projects to address COVID impacts. And we know COVID impacts in many cases were disproportionately hitting the more vulnerable people in town, including the people of color. And so I think that it was part of the ongoing discussion of what council wanted ARPA funds to be doing, if that makes sense. I'm not sure I understood the question fully.
I think one, I'm sorry, I do want to piggyback off of that. One of the things that's important when we're focusing and drafting these equity considerations is we're not just thinking about 3 lines out of an entire budget amendment to focus on, right? So it's what are the the race equity implications of the entire ordinance that we're proposing here? And a lot of this, ARPA aside, there's, what were some of the impacts of, for example, not having recreation staff for half of the year? Like, how does that impact access to recreational services for youth in our community? What is the impact of not having, fully funded HCD staff? Like, how does that potentially impact the most vulnerable among us? So I think that, and if we can't derive it, then we should just say we don't know. But I think and not to put words in Councilmember Fulcher's mouth, but, ARPA was just one piece of this $1.3 million thing. And so making sure that when we're looking at race equity considerations for these kinds of things, that we're thinking about the whole policy. Councilmember Stevens.
Thank you, Mayor. City Manager Fox, I think you should remember last year when there was a similar budget amendment that I expressed great frustration that you were using your position to make policy rather than to administer the policy. And that should you want to do something like that, you should at least come to the council and tell us your plan of what you want to do, and see if, since it is a change in policy, to see if the council agrees with that change in policy before implementing it. But apparently that didn't happen again this year, and I'm really don't understand how we can have 24 positions frozen and not and say that there's no projects that are on hold or frozen because of that. I mean, obviously we had as it was described earlier, an already full workload, and yet there's 24 positions that aren't filled. At the very least, we're not getting work done, or at worst case, we're creating a hostile work environment where people are being pressured to do more work than is reasonable for anyone to do. So just concerned. And the other thing, just one little example, I have constituents asking me about crossing guards. We have 2 crossing guard positions frozen, had them frozen, they're not non-frozen now, thanks to the council, that kids still have to cross the roads at those locations. And so how are we saving money if we're sending police officers out or other city employees out to do that crossing, and those people aren't doing the work that they're supposed to be doing because they're out doing the work of the crossing guards that we can't hire because the positions are frozen. Just stuff just doesn't make sense. And then, are we having to pay police officers overtime to cross students? I don't know. I'm just saying this looks crazy to me, but thank you.
And Councilmember Stevens, I appreciate that. I don't have that same memory, but if you can jog my memory on what you stated last year, and there hasn't been a hostile working environment created in the city of Tacoma Park internally. And I'll just say that it was only, a week or so, it was a conversation that I had with senior leaders about where the budget was when we brought the budget committee together to look at where we were projecting for the city to be. These were all internal conversations. No policy had been discussed or derived, because any time that we look at what we need to do, those items would have been brought to council through this budget amendment, and we would have this conversation like we're doing here tonight. What I have stated to senior leaders is looking at the budget and positions that have been on hold, and they've been hold for whether staff have left or they've been vacant for quite some time, or where they are was in the process. What I've stated to staff was hold off with hiring those positions, and we were going to put that in the budget amendment so we can bring forward to council to have that conversation. And also looking at telling staff to put that on hold, what I asked staff is to look at their positions and where they believe are mission critical and critical positions, they were approved to move forward, as well as, and coupled with, if they can find whatever that delta is equivalent to what it would be to hire that position, reduce their budget to be able to match that. And all that would have been brought forward to council through the budget amendment. That's what we were working on to bring forward to have that robust conversation. So when it was brought to council and it was stated and the council made the decision, I didn't get to the point where continue to gather all that information to bring it forth to council to have that conversation.
When the sustainability manager left and we did not start to look for a new sustainability manager, then the work is not getting done and can't be done.
That's incorrect. Once the sustainability manager left, we actually posted it, and I believe we went through a couple recruitments for it, and the last person that we had decided not to take the job, so we put it back out, so we're recruiting it again.
All right, I'll be quiet. Worn down. Thank you.
Councilmember Gibson.
Yes, just a minor point, since the question of priorities came up in terms of equity. I guess several times I've noted a sort of a cursory statements in terms of environmental considerations, and so I also would ask that a little bit more detail be put into that. In this particular case, I know that we reduced, there was a reduction in terms of stormwater. So that presumably had some impact, since stormwater is an environmental consideration. Just a recognition of and a suggestion that we could be more specific, a little bit more detailed in these both racial as well as environmental considerations to be more complete. Thank you.
Councilmember Small.
If it's possible for you to remember what you just said, right around the point where you were talking about the delta, when you were explaining the, I'm just trying to refresh your memory so that we're talking about the same thing. I'm curious about how it could be that, like, where does, like, if we tell the staff to cut by 5% or by 7% or any given point. But we also don't have the positions filled anyway. But all the work is getting done. But we can't do the work because we don't have the people. I just don't, I'm not trying to be difficult and I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot. I just don't understand what the logic behind this is. Like, it's not that I wouldn't be willing to hear it or anything, but in the grand scheme of things, if the allocations are coming in and we seem to be on track with regard to, generally speaking, the allocations that are the big chunk, and the anticipated revenues from the other funds like stormwater or the speed cameras are along the measure of what forecasts are, then I just don't understand how we can't figure out where we are with regard to projects and where we are with regard to the costs associated with the positions. And we can see the costs associated with the positions, but is it like I can make a motion that we hear from the directors about what things they were unable to accomplish up to this point or something, but it just seems like it's hard to figure out why we would be doing this particular reduction of the fund back into the splits that it may be, whether that be capital or the other enumerated funds within the reserves, if there's work to be done, unless we're admitting that we just aren't doing the work. And I just don't, like, is that what we're really saying? I just don't understand. Like, I'm not trying to be difficult. I just don't understand how the things go together. Like, if we're purposely reducing from the city manager's office and the call goes down to do that, and then there's purposely a hiring freeze that the council lifts, and then there's purposely a reallocation of all these funds, including ARPA funds, that we have to give back if we don't spend, I just don't understand. And it would seem like that's a management ethos, philosophical budget decision. And I mean, I could be really specific about all, like any number of things in here, but I'm still stuck on that. And I don't understand. I don't understand. Like, it would seem to me that, like, we're trying to hire positions. We don't even have all the positions in human resources hired. So, like, I would at least be like, well, you know, we've hired the positions in human resources. We expect that we'll be able to take on more interviews or blah, blah, blah. Like, there's just nothing here about that. And there are just so many confusing things. And I just was wondering, when you said the delta, I assume that meant all of the things that were semi-confusing at a point of explanation. And so I would like to go back to that and see if I can understand more fully. Does that make sense? Like, I'm not trying to be a jerk, I just don't get it.
I'll try my best to answer, because you had several questions in that, and if I don't, let me know. So I would say, I'll start with this. So what you have before you this evening are reductions into vacancy savings positions that have been vacant since the beginning of the fiscal year. Prior to me having any conversation with department heads, that happened literally 2 weeks ago. And so that's that. The conversation with department heads is after a conversation with our finance team and our budget team, looking at where we would be projecting by the end of the fiscal year. There was a deficit delta that we were looking at, and Director Chung provided that to council. Was it last meeting? Last meeting, when she provided the fiscal health and she walked through. So what we we're working towards understanding what that deficit number was and trying to align the budget where we could end in a positive like we did last year. There was conversations that we had with departments. And that's when I asked departments 3, 5, and 7 to look at their reductions. And I asked them in that 3, 5, and 7, if there are critical positions that they need to hire, then they were able to provide context to the city manager's office and the finance team on where those positions were. Now, one of the departments that you prescribed is human resources. Human resources was one of the critical positions that was actually moved forward with hiring. There was conversation, HCD had positions that we talked about, they was moving forward regardless of the freeze because we had a conversation and they were able to find that money within their budget.
Okay. So if all those, I get all of those things. I get all of those things. I guess if the original deficit that we were discussing is related to the bond and the fact that we have to pay the bond back and all of the bond monies are carried in this budget, which is basically what I thought we were talking about last time. But the bond money is to be paid back over time, then I don't understand how these savings, which aren't savings to me, correlate with the need to protect that deficit, which I wouldn't necessarily call a deficit, I would call a debt. And so that's where I'm confused, because all of these, presumably all these things go together in a jigsaw puzzle that is the budget. And so that's the part that I don't understand.
So in looking at it, you take, if I don't have the PowerPoint with me tonight, but if you remember the PowerPoint and when the director went over, it was the $9 million towards the end, and she said back out the $5 million for the bond for that debt.
Yes.
You back that out. There is $4.5 million,
Yes.
which is the deficit figure that is what we're working off of. So these savings of positions that we haven't filled, these savings would have, when you look at the expenditure line at 36.6 million, it would have reduced that figure of what we had to spend. So it would took it down to, well, with this budget amendment, it would took it down to 35 million. And so what we were looking at to try to bring the expenditure within line of revenues to try to equal the revenues as best we can towards the end of the fiscal year.
So one point. So I definitely believe that there needs to be, and Director Chung, if you can provide more clarity. Because my understanding from the presentation that we received was that the expenditures for the library and all of our budget amendments, which did put us over budget, I want to say maybe it was like 137,000, something like that, put us over budget. But the revenues that you were considering for that difference was not based on the bond. It was actually based on our general fund revenues. And so we were showing a deficit because the expenditures were far exceeded our general fund revenues, but that also did not account for necessarily the fact that we had this money in our bond fund that was sitting over there, that $5 million, right? So, because it's in a different pot, and so what you were trying to balance was our expenditures, because we're doing a lot of spending on the construction of the library, and our general fund revenues. And the library bond dollars, that $5 million, is in a separate account somewhere else, and that wasn't taken into the calculus. So it would be helpful, because if that were the case, then our original budget that we approved the last council, we approved a budget that was $5 million in the hole. And we did not do that.
Actually, if I may, Mayor, at the adopted budget of fiscal year '23, we were $7 million. And I back out the $5 million because that $5 million was actually supposed to be taken out from the bond reserve, okay? The bond reserve is supposed to account for the library expenditure that is in the capital improvement project. So the $5 million in the bond reserve washed off the CIP $5 million, okay? So that's why $7 million in the total deficit minus the $5 million in the bond fund, which it is accounted for already. So the net deficit that is in our general fund, without consideration of the library, is $2 million only. And because of the 2 budget amendment or 3 or 4 budget amendment that we had funds need to appropriate in fiscal year 23 in the first budget amendment for a lot of CIP projects. And that include, I think, about maybe $1 million or $2 million, okay? And also we have 2nd, 3, and 4 budget amendment related to the salary increase, to the police, and also to the union members and non-union members. That actually, from the beginning of the adopted budget, we were $2 million in the net deficit, plus the budget amendment with another $2 million. So our net total deficit at the end of the year, it would have been $4.5 million. So that was one of the slides that I was trying to explain, and it was a little confusing. And then I had a lot of questions about how I came up with 4.5. So this is how I calculate that the net deficit. If we didn't have this budget amendment 5, we would have a $4.5 million net deficit.
When you say net deficit, are you meaning that above the allocation and distribution of funds that the town receives in addition to its segregated income funds, so made up in reserves? Is that what you were saying when you were saying deficit? So I understand, there were $2 million gap, which you took out of the savings account to make up. Okay.
Deficit is actually comparing the revenue to the expenditure. Yeah.
That I know, and I understand like credits and debits and all those kinds of things and the bunny eared, all that stuff I got solid. What I am trying to understand is the actual language by which this is being discussed. Because if you have money that you know is coming in and it is X, but you have things that you want to do and they are X plus Y, then the Y is made up by your reserves, theoretically. Either it's reserves that you specifically have enumerated for like capital expenditures or something else, so you put those into the budget and then it evens out. And so it's technically a deficit, but it's a balanced budget because you have you're planning to spend all of the money that you put into the mix. And so I'm trying to figure out if the council put $2 million over the constant yield rate allocation and the speed cameras and the licensing from cable and all of the other inputs, including the revenue, that they said we are going to be $2 million short. And so let's put $2 million from reserves to allocate across these things in order to make this budget balanced. Did that happen?
Yes, with the existing reserve we have, now right now, our unassigned reserve is $4.6 million as of our financial statement at fiscal year 22.
So outside of the operating, like the 3 months reserve, there is a savings account.
Yeah.
And in that savings account, we decided to put X amount of money in to cover the difference between what we were being given by the state and parties and what the council envisioned or what the staff envisioned spending. And so that deficit that was voted on by this council in the budget is $2 million.
We just looked at the budget amendment for, it was a $2 million carryover. That is what was in there. So in the committed reserve, our general reserve fund has about give or take $6 to $7 million. $2 million in reserve in the budget amendment 4 was what we were told. These were some CIP projects that needed to carry over. And so it was, so the council did not vote to operate at a deficit as far as, or to increase the, right, $2 million. We voted to say, we're not going to be able to do these things, so carry them over. So it was my understanding that those resources are sitting in the committed portion of the general reserve.
You're right. You're correct, Mayor. But let me say that the city is fortunate right now because we are following the reserve policy. We are keeping our unassigned reserve at a 17%. What I'm trying to tell is our unassigned reserve, if we continue to have this deficit, the reserve balance will be dwindling, will get depleted year by year. So every time if we dip into reserve, let's say for each year we dip into $1 million or $2 million, what I'm trying to say is in a few years or maybe less than 10 years, all our unassigned reserve, including the committed reserve, will be depleted. That's what I'm looking forward to avoid this expenditure higher than revenue situation. I'm not saying that right now we are in a stressful or extremely bad financial condition. I'm just giving an alert that we don't want to be continuously, having expenditure higher than revenue, because that means we are going to use the reserve money. Okay, every year, maybe we're in a deficit of 1 million or 500,000. It's still getting the money from the unassigned, or even if you want to, coming out from the committed. Because committed or unassigned, the council has full capability to release those money and use it, okay? You have full capability, whether it is in unassigned, in committed, or in assigned reserve, the council has the capability to release it and use it, okay? It's just a different category of the reserve fund. Only the bond reserve is restricted. That is totally for the purpose of payment of the library construction, not for the payment of the bond payment. Bond payment, we're taking it out from the mortgage account, and that is called debt service account. That is still in the general fund. We have a debt service account, and for the past few years, I think there was a question about why did we have a deficit starting from 2017 or 18? It is mainly, one of the reasons I would have to say is because of the debt payment that we're paying. And in 1 year, I believe, because of the 250,000, I forgot the name of the debt we have to pay, we have to add up to about $1 million in debt service payment. And that is coming out from the expenditure. The debt service is part of our expenditure, okay? So that costs the expenditure higher than the revenue.
So there is one portion of our, and I know we're getting kind of off topic, and I want to make sure that we're able to get to the committees, but there was one aspect of the debt. So we have the debt for the library, but then there was debt that we had taken out for gosh, I'm blanking on what it was, but we're nearing the end of this building. Yes, thank you, Arthur. We paid for something. And we're nearing the end of paying that debt off, correct? And so based on your calculation in terms of where we need to be in terms of our debt management, I always worked under this assumption there was a bit of a changing of the guards, right? Pretty soon, the debt on this building will go away, and then we'll be left with the library. In your calculations around our debt concerns, did you take that into consideration as well?
Yeah, the debt service will continue, but then because of the principal payment that we're making every year, the interest payment is going to reduce. So the debt payment from the general fund is going to go down. You know, our curve for the debt service was like this. For the first few years, it was very sharp going down, okay? So at the end of the payment, just like our mortgage payment, we pay mostly interest in the first few years, or in the first 10 years, because it's a long-term debt, okay? And then at the middle of the payment term or at the end, we're paying mostly principal. So that everything coming out from our debt service expenditure account. While for the bond restricted fund, it is mainly for the payment of the vendor. When RR&M asks us to pay them for $500,000, you know, payment for design or something, we took that money out from the bond reserve, okay? This is another type of payment. We have to make the payment for the construction of the library, and that comes from our bond reserve. And on the other hand, our mortgage payment is taken out from our debt service account, and they are both in the general fund,
Okay.
okay?
So it sounds like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, and we could probably talk about this all night. It sounds more to me that maybe this is a matter of semantics. I mean, I don't pretend to be an accountant. But it sounds like there is a desire due to our debt management, our debt levels, to have a higher cushion in our reserve amounts. And I know that the prior council had established that 17% threshold, which I was under the impression was an appropriate level for us to have. So if what you're saying now is that we need to be more aggressive than that 17% to make sure our bond amounts are higher, or that we need to be more aggressive in ensuring that we're not budgeting beyond so we're not tapping into the reserves, then that is helpful. But I really want to caution us against using certain kinds of terminologies like, oh, we've been operating under a $5 million deficit, because we have $7 million in the reserve. Like, now, if we wanted to, what we probably, hindsight is 2020, we did vote to, in essence, increase through incremental, piecemeal budget amendments like this, right? Council will make certain decisions perhaps without fully understanding the ramifications of the budget as a whole. For Budget Amendment 4, it was a $2 million carryover, like saying work that we had done before was going to be carried over. That is now sitting in the committed reserve, right? So that money is there. It's not a part of the 4, it's a part of that extra 3 that's sitting somewhere.
Yes.
But we did vote to increase by 137,000. I think it was 130 or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And so at the time, it was something that was really critical. But what we'll need to do going forward is really, and we're going to need you all's help, think long and hard before we bring these types of budget amendments forward and make it really clear you're voting to increase your budget by $137,000. Because those incremental, to your point, it's not the 2 million, because the 2 million was already accounted for in the last budget, is sitting in the committed reserve. It's the 137,000 And if you do that, those kinds of incremental things over time, going over your budget by those small amounts,
Exactly.
you start to tip away at
Exactly.
your general reserve.
Yes, yes. We are not in a dire situation that we are in a financially stressful condition, but I'm just giving an alert that we need to watch our spending. We need to make sure that we have to make sure that our going expenditure can be covered by a going revenue. This is the idea of a balanced budget.
Mayor, may I have
Yes,
1 minute
Councilmember
to just
Siemens?
follow up
Yes.
on that? And it seems like that this discussion, and I'm glad that you're able to come to our meetings when we're preparing our budget each year. I think it's very helpful, and that's when it's appropriate for this type of discussion to go on, when we're actually doing the budgeting and setting the budget. And I think, you were at our budget meetings last year, Mr. Fox, and if there was any concern about the budget, that would have been the time to discuss this, not to just make decisions outside of the council to rectify a problem that wasn't presented as a problem during the budget discussions. Thank you.
And I want to assure that if our bond reserve is completely depleted, it will give us a clear picture what is our actual unassigned reserve look like. Right now, our committed reserve, our equipment replacement, unassigned, they're all included in a reserve account that is kind of confusing. So once our bond reserve is depleted, because when we make the payment for the library construction, it will make us a lot clear of what actually our unassigned reserve look like. And also in the coming years, the debt service amount is going to go down. Okay, the highest payment was already, I believe it was in fiscal year 22 or 21. We had made a lot of high debt service payment. But then since that payment is made, the coming year, I can see that our bond payment, meaning that our debt service for the mortgage payment of our bond, is going to come down, and then the total expenditure will not be that great. So it could help, that we try to keep our expenditure, in line, to make sure that we are in line with the revenue. Then we may not dip into our reserve that much. It's okay to dip into the reserve, but make sure that it's not going down like $2 million or $3 million. And you can see that our total unassigned reserve right now is just 4.6.
And that's
And just-
that's at that
Yeah.
minimum 17%.
Yeah, that's the minimum 17.
And
you-
part of that's going to change too when we start, because we already start looking at numbers, because there has been an increase. So whether healthcare, personnel, all that's going to go up. And so that's where conversation on reserves are going to come into play this next year as well.
Okay, all right.
And I'll just say, just in Councilman Siemens, as far as conversations like this, if you remember when I presented the budget last year, my first budget, there was conversations that I put on the record about where we are with the budget, as well as I had individual meetings with, I know the 3 returning members remember conversations about the budget I've had with you in our check-ins as well. So I just want to just make sure that's on the record.
Councilmember DeBala?
Yeah, so I would really like to get to committees. So I'm looking, just to recap for the new folks. So there was the budget amendment, number 1, which is labeled agenda item 4. You were saying.
I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
messed that up.
That was the one, that is the big one. That's the one that it says carryover, $2 million. And then there was an increase of not 137, but $142,000 for things like phones for new people, who were hired, and a rec center appraisal, which needed to be done in order to do the rec center project, laptops, things that weren't thought of but they add up to 137,000 in new spending. My understanding and the way that this is presented is that we budgeted for the projects that added up to the 2 million in the previous fiscal year. For a bunch of reasons, they didn't get done. And we affirmed that we wanted to still do them. What wasn't clear to me was that we needed to think about not doing them. So that's my perspective. But we did that. So as far as I was concerned, financially, it was a wash, in terminology aside. And I see the budget director nodding her head saying, yeah, we had the money, we had budgeted the money, we text people for the project, and then we're, okay, so, but there was new money there. There was new money, the other two budget amendments that are mentioned in the notes in the cover sheet for tonight, both of them, I think it's important to point out, concerned settlement, union I'm not going to use the right word. Personnel expenses for the two wage increases that were ratified by the two local unions, plus then treating every other staff person equally. So that did add up to some fairly decent sized numbers, just FYI. $251,000, and what would the other one was $83,000. So 250 plus 83. So that's not a small amount of money, but that's what they were for. So here we are with additional expenses in this year's budget, primarily for personnel, primarily related to negotiations for union, for wage increases. And so now we have, if I understand it, a proposal to account for the salary savings, primarily to account for salary savings for vacant positions, and to account for grants received, and a couple of increased revenues is one way of putting it, and one increase in expenses of $17,000. So in closing, if I got the summary right, then my question still is, and are we sure we want to reduce? We're not going to need this salary money, because in previous years, I thought that we were not reducing it until the end of the year. So that's just a question, and then I'll stop. And we don't even have to answer it right now if we're running behind time.
I'll be very quick. No, we're not going to be able to spend it. So reducing
There's
it
no
now
way.
makes sense, because as I stated earlier, most of these positions, there's some that's on the sheet on your docket tonight that we've already hired a few of those folks that started within the last couple weeks. The rest of them are in process and working through. So over the next couple months, they're going to be coming on board.
And that's why my request for where we are in the process of hiring of the hiring process for each of those vacancies, and why my request for is this the net savings? Does it account for the costs associated with promotions? Just to make sure before we vote to reduce that we really have thought of everything. Not that I doubt Director Chung in any way, but I just want to be clear that we're getting it right this time. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
All right. Seeing no more lights, I'm going to turn the discussion over to our city clerk, I believe, who's going to. Oh, sorry. Sure. Let's take a quick 5-minute break. my mic on. We're going to get back started, and we'll begin talking through the next agenda item, an overview of city boards and committees. And for this discussion, I'm actually going to turn things over to council member.
Before we start that, I just wanted to note that Councilmember Honzak has been unable to communicate with us, but I think the technical problems are fixed now. So she had her hand up before and was
Oh,
never able
I'm
to be.
so sorry, Councilmember
So we-
Honzak.
It's okay, I understand, and besides, as everyone knows, I have a sore throat, but
thought that's what you were
I will contribute thoughts later.
I tried texting you to see if you were able to get through, but maybe.
No, I could hear everything everybody was saying, but unfortunately, I guess I was, my hand raised wasn't able to be seen and things like that, but I will hopefully be able to stay, you will be able to see me. I will try to call Jessie or ping her if that happens again. Thank you.
Okay, council member, so with that, I will turn things over to council member Dabala. And I believe she has a presentation.
Presentation that, that the city clerk and I would like to see brought up.
Actually, I'm going to bring it up. Just give me a second. I
That
was
the city
distracted
clerk
with
is
the
going to
other.
bring up because she made the changes this afternoon.
Yeah.
Typos, nothing major.
Yeah, give me just a minute. Why don't you start talking in the meantime?
Okay, so, for something completely different and hopefully more fun, city committees. Now, why are we talking about this? Because the city council appoints, members to, city commissions, boards, and committees, and we do it twice a year, right after a recruitment process. We are in the middle of the recruitment process, closes February 8th. And then right after that, we are going to be faced with making appointments. So that's why we're talking about this tonight, to give you an overview of what committees and commissions we have, to talk about the obligations of the council, and to affirm the obligations of the council, and particularly the approach. Next slide, please. To the appointments process, and to flag a few remaining issues that we need to address in the future, hopefully sooner rather than later. So next slide, please. What do we have? We have, I think it's 11 committees, boards, and commissions. The difference is that boards and commissions have a regulatory or a quasi-judicial, some specific decision-making authority. The committees are advisory to the council. It's an important distinction. We have a couple of additional groups that don't fit the model. The police chief's advisory board is working with the police chief and is appointed by the police chief, not us. There's a police pension review board. I think y'all got an email about how there's the 2 citizen vacancies. That's primarily a professional board with people who focus on pensions and financial, but it has a space for 2 citizen members. And the city council does also have the authority to set up task forces. They're lean and mean, they're a little more technical, they're more focused, they're set up by resolution. This is the specific set of questions, this is when we need it done by. As a council, we do that. So think sustainable banking task force, police, public safety task force, quick in, quick out, much more technical. The difference between the commissions and the advisory, the difference between the commissions and the advisory committees, think tree commission. Tree commission, here's appeals. So that's a regulatory function. Okay, next slide, please. I don't know why it does that, but the next slide basically says what the authorities are in code. So all of these groups are in the city code. And the advisory committees are much more standardized. They're a common size, they have term limits, they're city residents only with one exception. Annual reports to the council, council reviews and feedback. That's one of our obligations. And members are required, as we are required to do the ethics forms, they are required not to do forms, but to sign a code of conduct. And the city does offer stipends for members. Somebody needs to go home late at night by Uber, they need to hire childcare to go to a meeting. Not everybody can afford to do that themselves. So we instituted stipends to help people who need the help. Boards and commissions don't streamline that well. They do have the same, they do have term limits, but it's 3-year terms, not 2-year terms. If you think election board doesn't make sense to have 2-year terms when you have elections every 2 years. And they are also required code of conduct, stipends available. And in the code, which Jesse has, the city clerk has provided for you, you'll see that their functions are codified, and as you read them, they're much more tailored to the specific topic. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? You put in 1 and 2, thank you. 2 slides with the same title. I'm not the best PowerPoint producer here. It started, I believe, with a survey of committee members. It might have started before that with committee member complaints. Yes. And so there was a survey and a bunch of background information in 2018-19 that was gathered that pointed the city council to the fact that we needed to take a more systematic look at how this was working. Some committees working really, really well, some committees not so much. And a lot of concern about feedback from the council. So there was a working group, staff and council, that made recommendations. We have a couple of people sitting up here who were on that committee, and that was the basis for the council work sessions in 2021. We have a couple of people sitting up here who were on the subgroup for the council that worked on the recommendations for the council. So in the fall of 2021, we made code changes. And along the way, there were a couple places where we went back to committee members, committee commission board members, and, sought their input, and here we are. So it seemed like this was a better way to do it, or at least to try. And the areas that we focused on were operational improvements, recruitment and appointments, because the previous system had been 1 by 1. There's a vacancy, oh, here's somebody to fill it. So you could never really get ahead of that and say, how do we achieve a more diverse, a more representative balance of members? You could never, as I say, get ahead of that. And to me, that was a really important thing, that we have committees that reflect the people who live here and the people who work here. And when there was a wild number of committees, and they had purposes all over the map. And that was another thing that we really wanted to focus on. Next slide, please. So what we wound up with, I may be repeating myself a little, common membership, common terms of service, common purposes focused on advising the council, very limited exceptions. A semi-annual recruitment system, not the one-at-a-time appointments, more support and training to the committee members, and we talked about the code of conduct and stipends. Jesse, our city clerk, is the point of contact for all of these folks. That's a big job in and of itself, because we are talking over 100 people at any given moment. Just pointing that out, plus the training and the support. She's the primary, her office is the primary lead on all of that. And she'll be commenting on, she's been an integral part of this from the beginning, and thank you very much to all of the staff up here who have worked on this over the years, because I think we are better off. And the city clerk will have a chance to speak in a minute. So all of this had to get reflected in streamlining and amending the code language for committees, which we did. The Youth Council and Grants Review Committees are integral to our operation, and yet they were not even in the code. Go figure. So we did that. And again, City Council has responsibilities for appointments and for recruiting and for giving feedback to the committees, at least the once a year. Was this the place where you were going to talk about the stipends? And yes.
I can do that.
Yeah, back up, please.
Okay.
Before we get into what we haven't done, let's talk a little more about what we are doing. So as far as the operations of the system and how the code of conduct and stipends, which are new items, didn't used to have them, how they're working, could you comment on that whole package of things for us, please?
Sure. So the council created the code of conduct that all committee members are to sign. I have to say there probably are a few who didn't sign it.
Who hiss?
But not, I don't think it was because they wouldn't adhere to it, but they just, it can be challenging.
Especially with, let's remember, we did all of this during COVID. And so many of the committees are still virtual. Some people have not actually met each other yet. So it is really a challenging environment in which to start building new teams.
Yes, that is true, for sure. So the council also approved a stipend in the amount of, for all board and committee members, of $40 per meeting attended. So the process for that is that everyone has to fill out a form, and on that form, they can opt out altogether, or they can tell us that they do want their stipend, and then if they say they want their stipend, then we provide them forms that the finance office needs to be able to make payments. So I thought I would, and then, once we receive the minutes from the meeting, we can, we track the attendance at the meetings, and then quarterly, the stipends are paid. So it is very reliant on people filling out paperwork, and if they don't fill out their paperwork, or if they don't show the committee doesn't give us attendance information, we can't pay them. So that is part of the process. It's a little cumbersome, but generally it works. I thought you might be interested to know some statistics on the stipends. So believe it or not, and I haven't done the math, but there are 80 board commission and committee members. It's not 100, but I would think it was 100, but it's 80. There are 20 members didn't make a selection. They haven't opted in or out. 16 opted in, but have not submitted the forms in order to get paid. 32 opted in, and we have received forms and have been able to pay them. 11 opted out, and we have one youth council member who has requested SSL hours instead of the stipend. So I thought you might be interested to hear about that. Can I clarify one thing from before? When we talk about term limits as opposed to committee terms. So for boards and commissions, there are no term limits. So, for instance, the Board of Elections, every 3 years, members can apply for reappointment, and then it's up to the council whether or not to reappoint them. But assuming the council wants to reappoint them, they could serve for 50 years if you keep reappointing them. But there are designated terms for all the committees. For the advisory committees, there are term limits of 6 years or 3 two-year terms. And I don't know if there are any questions.
Did you want to say anything about the code of conduct? More?
I don't think so. I mean, I think I can say that the prior council felt it was necessary. We had a couple of incidents with committees that made it clear that that we needed them to explicitly agree to certain things. Since that time, we haven't had any particular problems. All's going well.
Looks like Kara has, Councilmember Hunzak has a question. Are you able to get to her?
No. All right, Councilmember Honzak?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I have a few questions. One is, you said that the youth council is now codified. Does that also codify the number of people on any of those councils?
Yes.
Yes.
It does. Is there, and pardon my ignorance, maybe this is written somewhere in the notes, but is there a reason that 11 members was chosen for that particular council? As I just happened to dig through the current rosters of the committees, and I noticed, I was kind of looking at ward distribution and other things, and really just exploratory. And I noticed that, for example, on that committee, if you have 11 members, there just so happened to be two members from each ward except for my ward, but there are only 11 members. So that means that some ward will always be potentially underrepresented. And I know that ward representation is not an exact science in general, but I was just kind of curious about that number.
I don't remember why the 11 number was selected. It was determined when the youth council was set up, maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
What I will say is, again, the prior council had a policy of, particularly with the youth council, of weighting ward residency more heavily for wards 4, 5, and 6. So that to the extent that there were applicants, there were intended to be over appointments from those wards.
But I would suggest that that's something this council might like to look into and change so that we could have 2 from every ward.
For of course, yes.
Yeah, and then perhaps that's something we could look at for, all the committees. I just, one that caught my eye because there was actually better representation equitably across the wards, except in that case on this committee.
Oh, interesting.
And quick question for the city clerk. One year I felt like we had alternates.
Yes, and the council did appoint alternates, and they can attend the meetings if they wish, of course, but they don't get the stipends. They're alternates. And we had an example where one person did drop off in an appointment and an alternate stepped up in their place.
I know that's particularly for youth council, because sometimes even if we were to go up to 12, sometimes we get some really, really awesome applicants, and it's kind of hard to turn anyone away. And so sometimes if it's a really hard choice, we have done alternates.
Right. And I have to say, we have also had some years particularly bad luck with people dropping off the youth council because they're youth. And sometimes they just realize they have other things that they would prefer to do.
But on the whole, that group has really
It's a great group,
worked
absolutely.
well. It's only been a few years since there's been a youth council, and it's been pretty awesome, actually.
Yes.
I think on balance, and I'm pretty impressed. And it goes so well with the 16-year-old vote, for example.
Councilmember, my government isn't working. Councilmember Honzak, did you have? Thank you. Councilmember Honzak, did you have any other questions?
I did have a couple of other small questions, if that's okay. I'm sorry, I can't see other people's lights. One was, I assume I know the answer to this, but in case I'm wrong, this is for Jesse, is the stipends, I presume that it is not public information who takes stipends even within a committee. Is that correct?
That is correct. The forms, they're filled out online and we're the only ones who see those forms.
Is that codified?
It is not codified, but that's our practice.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry, I didn't write down my other question.
And I should say, let me add one thing. That was council's clear intention.
Yeah.
When we set up the stipends, that it not be, that it be a private.
I imagined so much. I just thought I would just make it clear, make sure that was clear. Oh, I know. My other question was related to the one person that I understand is not a resident of Tacoma Park that's on one of the committees. Could someone just provide some background on that?
That's the Arts and Humanities Committee, and it's because, A, it was that way already, which isn't really a good reason, but the reason it was that way is because there are artists who work in Tacoma Park. So if you had an economic development committee, you might have a couple of slots for people who don't live here, but who work here or own a business here. So that was the spirit in which one slot was allocated to that committee. It had been more than one slot, and we cut it back, if I recall, and made it a lower priority, but wanted to leave the option. So that's why. And, you know, all of this is fungible, but, you know, this is the choices we had to make we had to do something. So this is what we did.
And then one more question, if you will, that I think is for Jesse probably. Have we seen a change in the applicant pool so far since the stipends and some of the other policies were changed back in fall 21, that especially in terms of representation? And I don't just mean across wards, but I just mean, you know, in terms of demographics of the city and whether that's sort of reflected in the committees, but also in terms of ward representation. You may not know the answer right away.
Yeah, I think I know the answer. I mean, I think more than anything, it has to do with recruitment. But I think the stipends do make a difference to some people, and that's I think it helps entice people to consider the opportunity.
And I brought the notes from the first semi-annual when we sort of rejiggered everything. And this is where I got the 100. There were 99 applicants plus 5 who lived out of the city. 36 applicants were of color, which is way more than before. And all but 4 of them were appointed. And 2 of those 4 were not eligible for the thing they were applying for, apparently. So we, in one pass, dramatically changed the age and the cultural and racial profile of the folks on committees. They tended to be older white homeowners, and with the exception of homeowners versus renters, we busted that open pretty well. Continuing that requires active promotion and recruitment every 6 months, not just from city staff, but also from council members, which is another reason we're talking about it tonight, because you still have time to recruit in your ward for different committees. The other point that I neglected to make along the way here was what? Yeah, we're gonna get to that in a minute. Oh, yeah. One of the drivers of this, it was the realization amongst the council and the staff that committees is one, it's not the only, and it may not be the best way, only one way to get input from residents. And I think the original committee system had assumed that that was the primary way that you would get input from residents. And that was something that we felt, all of us, I think, felt that we needed to de-emphasize this as the only way that you hear from residents and beef up some of the other areas. So when we had the priorities meeting on Monday night, there was a whole section about more responsive and engaged government. This is a piece of that. to see, but it's an important piece, it's not the only piece. Just want to make sure I said that. Okay, so current committee system, council responsibilities, recruit, appoint, annual check-ins, and now we're going to get to issues not finalized, and one of them is about the council. Next slide, please. And we are almost done. Yeah, yeah. So the last issue on this list, council liaisons for committees. The subgroup recommended and the council declined to decide. Couldn't agree on whether council liaisons for committees made sense. It is time consuming. It also, there was a view that by some council members that a council member being in the room, even if there's somebody that everybody knows personally and has been calling by their first name for years, can influence the dynamics because it's somebody who comes in with more power and authority in another role. So we didn't come to agreement on that. So that's one of the issues that's not finalized. There were a number of suggestions from a couple task forces. Remember I said task forces? Task forces make recommendations. We need to follow up on them. And there's a couple of recommendations for standing committees that we would want to return to as a topic at some point. And there are two existing committees that we put on hold, and I'm going to explain what that means in a minute, pending a final decision on them or some input from a group. The first is the Noise Control Board. We were at the time, the Noise Control Board, here's a, I might not get the jargon right. Here's both sides of a noise dispute. And there are a few of those. They're not a lot. It's not like they meet every week listening to people complain about somebody's cat. It's not like that at all. It's a serious business, but it doesn't happen very often. And there was some question as to whether the Public Safety Task Force would have some, have a comment on combining that in code enforcement function with some other things. So we have not been recruiting for it. There are only three people on that group at the moment, and they have not been meeting. So we really owe it to them to wrap this up one way or the other. These are issues we're not going to settle tonight. These are just heads up that these are things we need to spend some time on. The second one is the Nuclear Free Committee. The subgroup recommended that much of their work is done by, is at this point in time done accomplished in other ways. And they made a case for, they also have had recruitment issues. And they made a case for wanting to be allowed to recruit and try to get younger and more diverse people. And so we will see where we are with that. The first round of recruitment 6 months ago didn't yield a great deal of result in that respect. And that's a long story, but I'm just flagging it as another area we need to decide on. And so last slide, or is that the last slide? So the next, oh, okay, sorry. The next step for us is, as I said a couple times already, recruiting for committee members. You have the list of committees and the vacancies, everything but the Tree Commission and the Youth Council has a vacancy. Most of the committees have 7, not 9 members, and they're doing just fine. But if anybody is interested, there's space in almost everything. The council had worked the last couple of rounds with a subgroup of the council to review the applications with the city clerk and review them and make recommendations to the full council for appointments. Again, the idea to look at them all at the same time and not to be just one by one. And the criteria that we have been using, residency, and if there are any individual commission or board requirements, because in some of those cases, it spells it out. It must have XYZ background, only for the commissions and boards, not for the advisory committees. The expression of interest, and then this is really important, either technical expertise or lived experience with the issue. So a pretty broad definition there of interest and experience with the issue of the committee. If there's an organizational or community affiliation, what kind of personal background do they bring to the committee, and contributions that they can make to the group. So someone could be terrific in all of those other categories, and they're just not a team player, and everybody knows it. So that's the criteria we've been using. Now we really are coming to the last slide. I mean it this time. So again, the next steps, recruiting, making appointments, and the decision point for tonight, do we affirm that we want to do the subgroup approach to review the appointments, and then we need to find a subgroup, get volunteers. And then we want to look at some of those other issues, particularly the council liaisons, and Mayor, can we please start to schedule the review and feedback with the committees? Okay, so I'll let you take it from here. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? Particularly on the subgroup for reviewing appointments?
No, except that most of the committees have a staff liaison. So I'm not the only point of contact with the committees. That most of them have a staff liaison, and if they don't, I sort of serve in that role as a default. So we like to, staff thinks it's a good idea to get some staff input on the committee appointments as well. I mean, ultimately, of course, it's the council's decision, but as the subgroup looks at applicants, sometimes the staff liaison can bring information to the table that the council members might not have.
That's an important point. Like if a group is missing a certain perspective or a certain set of skills, that's really important. And I just want to say, if there is anybody out there still listening who's on a committee, thanking all of you for your participation and your work, particularly throughout the COVID years, because this is it's, as I said, it's not the only way to get input, but it sure is an important way. And I want to just make sure that you all know you appreciate it.
Yes, definitely. I want to echo Councilmember Dabala's sentiments around appreciation for all of the volunteers in our community that have worked tirelessly to bring important thoughts and ideas and direction to the council on important issues. And we appreciate all of the commitment that you all have done. So one question that I would like to, before everyone turns into a pumpkin really quickly, I like the subcommittee approach to reviewing applicants. And just so that folks understand what that means, a group of 3 council members would get the applications, and then you all may meet, chat via email and the like to kind of identify among the applicants' recommendations for the broader group. And then those recommendations are shared with the broader group. And then when the council comes together to have our work session around appointments, it's often very helpful to make sure that we're able to talk about, yes, we want to make sure that there's diversity there, that we have people from different wards. Sometimes there may be suggestions from other council members, but it allows for there to be a little cleaner discussion when we get to the work session as it relates to the appointments. So if folks are amenable to that, we would. Sure.
One, do we ask applicants if they're renters or homeowners? Is it only on Colta that we ask that?
We don't ask it, but we do take an address, so we do know multifamily, typically if they're multifamily properties, but we could add that to the application for future.
Okay. It might actually be helpful to make renters feel more included, because I think that some people think that they don't get to do the thing if they're not a homeowner, so. Are you able to join other committees other than the youth one if you're under 18, or is it only the youth one?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
In fact, one of our most loyal election board members was, I believe, a youth.
He
when
came on at
started.
16,
Yeah.
but now he's off in college.
Right, but I'm just as an example.
Yes.
Is the only contact that the committees usually have with staff that one staff liaison, or are there other staff members that interact with the committees?
Good question.
It depends on the committee. Let me think. I mean, it would depend. I mean, they of course can reach out. I mean, have the same rights as any other resident to talk to people, but typically the staff liaison is the main person, but it depends on individual.
Okay. And then how often do we as a council hear from the committees? And is there like a formal thing?
So it kind of depends on the charge of the committee. There are some committees that come to us annually where they're, they may be like the grants. They usually come to us around the time when they're getting ready to start making grant recommendations for awards, to kind of present to us all of the work that they've done to identify the recommendations for of grantees for funding. If it is a task force, they usually have really specific deadlines for when they need to come to us with a report or with some sort of recommendations. Other committees may come to us annually. I think, though, to the recommendation around council involvement with committees, that is something that I think we need to kind of flesh out a little bit more, because there are some committees that meet and don't necessarily interact with council in any particular way, just due to the nature of their committee, unless they have, a report or something that they want to, recommendations they want to bring before council. So I think when we do start talking about council's role and how we interact with committees, that would be something helpful for us to talk about. Is it, council members specifically working with the individual, identifying a particular committee that we're working with? Is it we make sure that there's, I'm working into the agenda consistently at a point in time when once a year at least, we have each committee kind of come before council to just tell us about what they're doing. I think there may be some ways that we can work that out. But I will say it kind of depends. I don't know, City Clerk, if there's any other examples, but it depends on the nature of what the group is charged with doing.
That's true. And it is the case that in the last few years, the council, because of other things on the agenda, has not had a lot of time to hear from the prior council. Just did not have a lot of time to hear from committees, and it wasn't able to be regularly scheduled. My sense is that the committees would appreciate being before council at least once, I think.
Okay, and my last question, have we considered expanding committees to include other non-residents similar to the Arts Committee as a way to sort of like liaise into like Silver Spring or DC or like PG County?
We considered it at the time and decided not.
Okay.
I just want to double check over at this end if either of the acting deputy city managers, who both have extensive experience with being staff liaisons to committees, have anything that they want to add. And both of whom were, Roz in particular, were very active in this this whole review and change process.
I would add that one of the things we heard quite clearly from a number of committees, not all of which are still in existence, was that members wanted more connection with council. They felt like their work might not have always been appreciated or not appreciated from the dais. And they wanted that, an annual check-in or some kind of connection. So the liaison was one idea of ways to do that. Another idea is an annual report to council. But I think there was some disconnect in how committees operated, appointed by council, and how they felt engaged with council.
One of the things that I did with the committee that I was associated with was alternated staff, all of the staff in the department to go and speak to the committee and let them know what they were doing from their perspective. And that way the committee got to actually know the staff person and actually also got to know the programs and things that we were running a little bit more extensively and had a name to tie to it. So that was one of the things, and I thought that the committee actually enjoyed hearing from different staff liaisons other than just, the one person attending all the time. So.
Councilmember Gibson?
Yeah, thanks. A couple of questions and comments. Actually building off this question about council role. I am aware of, a committee that we have here that's also in Mount Rainier, and it's the Environment Committee. And one of the council members who I interacted before this, I got this position, is effectively a champion for that committee. And so there's a role there that might not be able to be taken advantage of unless we encourage or allow it as needed. Talking again about the Environment Committee, I noticed looking over the various committees here that our Sustainability Committee, which was once Environment, is one of the most narrowly prescribed committees. It seems out of line with the other committees. And again, with my familiarity with Mount Rainier, they have a very active green team, the Sustainability Committee, that does the certification, but they also do more than that. So I guess that relates to a question about when the scope or purpose of committees or boards are, to be reconsidered or considered. And I guess I'm maybe, without knowing too much about how things work here, other than, reading what I have, wondering if we might change this, reconsider the scope of the Sustainability Committee.
Yes, the reason that it is the way that it is, and maybe the words, I haven't read the words in a while, maybe they read as unintentionally narrow. But the intent is that is the green team for Tacoma Park, including certification and coordinating the program ideas. The reason it's that and not the broader policy committee that the two previous iterations of the Environment Committee in Tacoma Park is because both of those committees, it was too broad to be functional. And the feedback was to make it a little narrower in order to be able to have it function in a programmatic sense. Function's not the right word.
Yeah, it was.
I don't know if that makes it, if I use the right word, but you're right. It is a little narrow.
It's
than it
narrow.
used to be.
It certainly is, as written, very much narrower.
Well, it is.
And
narrow.
again, in relation to what I do know of a functioning committee in another city.
Well, yeah, and how they function versus how this functions, it may be different from.
Well, they
what
have
their
to they
words
start
say
with the
on paper.
certification, but yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and I think to Council DeBala's point around that, we also had a recommendation from our sustainability manager at the time, who was the staff lead for that committee. Keep in mind, we have the tree commission, we have other groups that maybe kind of from a purpose perspective, somehow they kind of overlapped a little bit. And so, the sustainability manager at the time, thought that, hey, the green team, there's a lot there. And that could be a really good way of keeping the group kind of focused and not necessarily going over into like trees or because we did have other groups that were responsible for addressing those types of environmental concerns. So I think that was, and maybe that's the difference for Mount Rainier. We have a lot of environmentally focused kind of activities and groups that kind of touched upon certain aspects. And so to try to make sure that everyone had their lane clearly defined and there wasn't a lot of overlap was also something we were trying to consider.
So I guess the question is when or if we can review the scope or the purpose of a committee. I mean, when does that happen, or does that ever happen? I mean, how does that happen?
Sure. So we just updated a lot of the scopes. We still have some that we have to deal with, like the nuclear free committee. And so we don't have a specified deadline of when we do it in an annual way. I will say, looking at all of the charges, especially when you are dealing with folks that are currently sitting on these committees and are very passionate about what they're doing, is a little bit of an undertaking. It's not to discourage us from taking an approach of review. But one of the things that we did try to focus on when we were reviewing last year, and happy to share a lot of the slides, is not just about what we as council think is important, but what do the general public, what would they be interested in? Because we had a lot of committees, but there were no one sitting on them. Or if we had committees with charges that were too broad, there could potentially be some just tension in the group because they don't have a clear task or a clear path forward. So we really tried to consider a lot of those things. But if there are some modifications of a particular committee that you would like to bring forth, it's something that definitely we can talk amongst the council to get on the agenda to discuss. But I will say, just from our lived experience with doing that, it does require definitely conversations with work group leads that are currently on those committees, working with staff that is responsible for manning those committees to get a full understanding of what they're doing, what their charges are, what some of the issues that are at play. And then also thinking through what, and putting pen to paper on what modifications could potentially have to be made to the code, if any, because a lot of these charges and purposes are communicated in our code.
And if I might ask just a couple more quick questions. I mean, the criteria for selection of the committee, is that a part of the application process so that the various criteria is there as they're applying? Yeah, okay, thank you.
And the city clerk, so we had modified the application, correct? So when residents are applying to participate in a committee, there are these components that we look at are included as part of the committee application, correct?
I think so, but I'd be happy to share the application with the council so you could take a look at it and see if it meets the needs.
And lastly, I guess, and I don't know the various people that I've spoken with, whether they were on a board, a committee, or a task force, but there was some question about appreciation for what they did and that their recommendations may not have been followed up on. So I'm just wondering about what is the council's responsibility vis-a-vis recommendations from these various groups? Do we have to, and is there any impetus to try and move quickly that or not about those recommendations?
Yeah, so a lot of it kind of depends. I mean, because the recommendations are recommendations. So for example, the Public Safety Task Force had 50 recommendations, 5 of them. And so staff have been working to tick away at a number of those recommendations. But we're also revisiting that report. So for example, one of the recommendations was around establishing a standing committee. And so that would be something that we would need to come up with. And so I'm working to identify places in future agendas. We're probably going to hit the Public Safety Task Force stuff after the budget. But there's also the, the Deputy City Manager Grisby, was that the traffic?
It was the Complete Safe Streets Committee that presented a report. Council asked them to come back with more information, which they did. And then they felt like without additional direction from council, they didn't have any clear work and essentially disbanded themselves, or I don't know if that was intended to be permanent, awaiting council feedback
On their recommendations. And I believe those recommendations came in probably close to the time where we were,
Yeah.
So that was, that's another set of recommendations. There's also the recommendations that came out of the Sustainable Banking Task Force. So there was a number of reports, particularly that came in last year, that had quite a few recommendations tied to them, that we will need to, as a council, schedule some time to kind of walk through those recommendations and then work to identify which of those recommendations we would like to take up or work with staff, because some of them are staff, will have to be staff-led efforts, work with staff to identify to get an update on the status of where some of the implementations of some of these recommendations are.
Thanks. So it does, sounds like there's in place some sort of process when a report is made with recommendations, and presumably somebody on the council or some members on the council might take it upon themselves to shepherd it, down the way. So, I guess that sounds good. It may not be as fast as some people on these groups would like. And so moving quickly on that, we do what we can, I'm sure.
Yep. And I mean, I could speak firsthand from shepherding aspects related to the Public Safety Task Force. Some recommendations just take time. Some of the recommendations had budgetary implications. They had to be thought through as a component of the budget. There are some that required changes or coordination outside of the city. So it just depends on the nature of the recommendations that come in terms of, how fast they move. But it is helpful to have members of council who want to kind of lead that charge to help with kind of presenting and drafting materials that could help us with moving some of the recommendations forward.
That sounds good. And one related with that, then if there is a person that kind of take a lead on moving it forward, is also to report back to that task, that group, to let them know that we haven't dropped it. It's moving slowly because of X. Yeah.
And we also, for some of the reports we did, sometimes we get emails, but I know that for the public safety, we were trying to do that feedback loop for them to let them know that, hey,
The sustainable.
with sustainable banking, that was something that the last council specifically asked for, because sometimes we're working on it, but it just doesn't feel that way, because it could be like a traffic policy item on the agenda, and they may not realize that that's actually one of the recommendations that you made, traffic calming approaches. And you just may not realize that that's something that's implementing one of your recommendations.
Thank you.
Councilmember Small?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I don't understand why we wouldn't just go ahead and implement some sort of a formalized reporting requirement for all the committees every year. You could just do them all in one day, even if it was only like a 5-minute speech. It'd be like a nice, state of the city type deal. So I just wanted to say that we should do that. That's all.
Yeah, like what the Emergency Preparedness Committee did. When was that? I thought that was with this council, where they came in and they did 5-7 minutes.
I don't think they came across that. I know, I get what Jason.
Yeah.
I get what Councilman Small is saying, and that sounds good.
And I thought that we did, yes, we do have a formal reporting requirement. Each committee is required to report annually or at the request of the city council. It's RN that we need to be a little more diligent.
About scheduling and seeing it. Yep.
Yeah, you also have.
So then I guess, I'm sorry, my last question would then be, is it required that a formal meeting of good order, which would be like maybe a Wednesday, happen for these reports? Or could you actually do a separate day on like a Tuesday or a Thursday where you actually have these presentations?
Good idea, do it
Right.
on Monday.
Yeah, I don't think anything precludes us from having a special meeting outside of a Wednesday that would have the committees come in to present their annual report. So what I'm hearing is, and I don't want to, and I know I see Council Member Honzak's hand, I see a lot of lights. So it does sound like folks are amenable to us establishing a annual process where committees will establish their reports and then come before council to present on the work that they've done.
Or we sit out there facing the dais.
Oh, I like that.
How about sitting together?
Yeah, okay. And so I think that that's something that we can definitely work into future agenda. We'll just need to, City Clerk, if we can just chat about when folks would be ready with their reports. That would be great. Councilmember Honzak?
Yeah, I fully support that idea. I guess I have a few other things. One that might relate to that is I was thinking, I'm wondering if the previous council already considered, I know you considered having a member of council on a committee, but what about the idea of either having council members rotate attendance to committees so that there's always one council member just listening in even and kind of being in touch and they can ask questions just like the staff are coming in, and or having a single council person be a point person, not necessarily a person that attends the meetings, but they could have that one person that they could regularly reach out to, and when something needs to be elevated to the dais, that it could be done in shorter order.
I think the answer is yes, we considered it and again, didn't resolve it. Personally, I like the point person because it takes some of the pressure of the council member being in the room. Gets rid of that, but it
Yeah.
still allows for the connection. But it doesn't matter what I think at the moment. What matters is that we need to resolve that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so one matter, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Councilmember Honzak.
Oh, no, sorry. Can I just, a couple more things if that's okay? Yeah.
Mhm, sure.
Okay. One is I'm wondering also if the previous council considered, I'm sure that was probably considered, but codifying something about the maximum number of people from a particular ward on any given council, on any given committee or board, and I can understand they wouldn't want to codify a specific number because you also have to have that number of applicants, but then maybe capping the number from any given ward and potentially adding in a member from a ward that might not be represented if they've reached their limit, but we get new applicants in the next round, even like you said, the tree commission is full. Is that in the code anywhere or was it discussed?
So I think that's two questions. The limit on membership is in the number 9 is in the code.
Sorry, but the limit, sorry, I meant a cap on the number of
The
people
cap
from
on the
any
number of
given
people
ward.
from a ward is not, we did, I don't recall discussing it specifically. And I think that's because the idea was to reach out to people throughout the community and address, why would you want to do that? You would want to do that in part because some wards are different demographically from others. So instead of doing it by ward, we did it by, we want to see more diversity of all the different types of people across the city, rather than say no more than 4 people from, forgive me, Ward 1. Ward 2. pick on word two.
And I think another thing that we were dealing with at the time, was low levels of recruitment, right?
So true.
So for some of our quasi judicial committees, if you don't have enough people, it's a problem. So
Good point.
we didn't want to necessarily put in a bunch of restrictions, but wanted to create decent incentives to try to get people from other wards and more diverse people and younger people to want to apply. And I think, doing things like offering the stipend and some of the things that we've been doing is working to kind of diversify things a bit. I think the biggest thing, again, is still getting the word out about these committees and really trying to make sure, more than anything, that our committees are relevant for the people in our community. I say all the time, when we established that public safety task force, I have never seen so many applicants for a committee in my life. There were probably like 40 some odd people that applied. So it is about making sure that we are identifying the right topics to bring people together, and that we're using the right vehicle to do it. We're talking a lot about our standing committees, but we will have a lot of opportunities to also do things like create task force, which are shorter, not necessarily in the code, kind of get in for a couple of weeks, few months, get in, then get out. But those are some of the principles that we'll need to keep in mind when we want to establish resident groups, and what is the right mechanism to do that will be important.
I'm sorry, now I have a question. So that implies, to some degree, that there would be, or scratch that. I would like it if we did some sort of consideration of neighborhood associations and whatnot vis-a-vis these other organizations, insofar as they are actually democratic places within the city that have import on the opinions of the residents. So if, I don't know if that's a component part of this, or if we can make that more explicit, but since specifically with regard to traffic calming issues, there is a nexus here, it would seem like it would make sense.
So I have two things to say about that. One is, in the criteria, there is one of the criteria is, are you representing a community group or neighborhood association? So it is kind of built in, which is important. And then the second thing is, this again, not the only way to get input on an issue. And we have to keep saying that and keep reminding ourselves of that. So if I am working on an issue, in addition to whatever the committee thinks, what do the relevant neighborhood associations think? You're absolutely right. That's really important.
Yeah, and we added that component because for some of the committees, it is about education. And so like education outreach and really trying to get the word out around things like tree policy and things, of that nature. And so it's important to make sure that you have some people on your committee that are actually connected in the community in a way that can help with spreading the word.
I just wanted to make sure that I'm explicit about the fact that I like geographically related organizations have a different sort of import than just a collective ad hoc that has either a common interest or agenda, because of the fact that they are actually represented. So I just wanted to make sure I made that clear.
Okay. So one last thing that I want to make sure that we're able to cover so we can get out of here before, we jinxed ourselves by saying we were going to get out early. So can I get volunteers?
Agreement? Do we have agreement?
Do we have agreement around establishing a subcommittee that would pre-review committee applications? Councilmember Honzak?
Sorry, I was raising my hand to be a volunteer, but then I didn't unraise it.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So we got one volunteer. And again, this is just to serve as a small group that would be pre-reviewing committee applicants that come in. to make recommendations to the council regarding appointments. Okay, so we have our three: Councilmember DeBala, Councilmember Honzak, and Councilmember Fulcher. Thank you all so much for your service. We also try to streamline recruitment, so it happens in a collective. So although we may receive, and city clerk, we're still doing the quarter recruitment, right? So
It's semi-annual.
semi-annual, thank you. So it's kind of like you get a bunch of applications around a set time, you review them, and then we wait for the next time.
Yeah, there's, I think one of the things that we have is the people who have applied already.
Yep.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So there's still room.
Yes, and so I want to encourage folks in the community, if you're interested in volunteering, please check out our website and sign up to be a volunteer for a committee. All right.
Mayor, your seat, or Clerk Carpenter, it is February 8th, is that right? Is that the new deadline?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, just wanted to say that out loud. I know
February
people are probably listening at this hour, but.
All right. Excellent. All right, so Councilmember DeBala, do you have any other?
Thank you for your attention at this late hour.
Excellent. All right, well, without seeing any additional lights, I would like to suggest that we adjourn this meeting. Do I have a second? Second. Excellent, meeting's over. Have a good night.
Nice.
Good.